Ato, anyway, the resource speaker and the distinguished guests will be acknowledged after this. So let me partly anchor the rationale on the very first assignment given to us by our global citizenship professor in the person of Dr. Nuruddin Salam, where he required us to answer a survey on what we must consider when understanding peace. And the first choice is to start at the local situation. The second option is to approach the global concept directly. And the third is to consider both the local and the global situation. But whatever is our answer, I know these stand on reasons. Now, in making a simple analysis on our topic today, we can somehow grasp an idea that peace education should start at the ground level. On a second thought, the question of whether it is anchored on the global concept also reverberates to claim that the universal idea must be considered. Otherwise, a conflicting concept on peace education will arise between the local and the international context. Somehow, the arguments of those who answered that both the local and global concepts must be considered when learning peace, that of course includes myself, stand on a good ground. Be that as it may, it appeared that either way is accepted. Anyway, one good thing in peace education is that there is no wrong answer. Painful it may be to accept, but the Philippines, of all the good things it has been known, has also share of the infamous events that form part of the world's history on violence. In Mindanao alone, we have the massacre in 2009, the butchery of sub-personnel in 2015, in the bombings in Davao City in the Holo Cathedral, and many others. On a personal note, law enforcer as I must admit that my knowledge on peace before is no better than that of a layman's. And back then, I am one with the majority of the troops that defines peace simply as the mere absence of violence. An unacceptable definition that is wanting of substance. While we recognize our important rules in peace and security, we focus on our role as peacekeepers, but not much as peace builders. But that was, I must say, the old days. Things change as our nation notion on peace gradually transformed in the advent of peace education, which on the other hand is also very determined to inculcate culture of peace. Thus, I say that the birth of peace education is not only a welcome development, but significantly, it will be the foundation of the collective efforts of our government to attain long-lasting peace. Earning a degree on peace is a good start. More than that, it also serves as an inspiration to keep the fire burning and continually propagate a culture of peace. That is why, despite this unseen enemy beleaguering us, the COVID-19 and of course all of its variants, we really push in organizing this webinar as we are also motivated by the positive response of a peace educator who is really devoted in sharing passion or his passion on peace education. And likewise, we have the presence of students who clamor to internalize peace on their sincere desire to continue the mission. And we are very fortunate today that no less one of the respected authorities on peace education in the global community is here with us to discuss development of peace education in the Philippines in consonance with the global peace. A topic that will not only enlighten us of the birth of peace education in the Philippines, but perhaps we will come to know who are the forerunners and also if our peace concept reconciles with the global context. It is a once in a blue moon opportunity to hear of all of these things directly from the horse's mouth. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you very much, sir. At this point, let us welcome Dr. Noruddin Salam, Professor of Peace and Development, Cotabato State University, as he will deliver to us the welcome remarks.
Namun sa baba.
Okay, in the name of God, most beneficent and merciful, Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, praise be to God. Greetings of peace. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning. Magandang umaga at isang mapayapang umaga sa ating lahat. I would like to pay courtesy to our international speaker, Dr. Swee-Hin, for gracing this event as our source person. The president of Cotabato State University, my brother, Dr. Sema Dilna, the youngest presidents of universities in the Philippines, the dean of the graduate college, my sister, Dr. Tarhata Yamalon, the chairperson of Peace and Development, Dr. Jose Arnold Alferez, my mentor, my former teacher, Dr. Estrella Cantalopez, my co-teachers in the graduate college in Peace and Development, Dr. Blah, we have Dr. Kadil, Dr. Bukia is also, I think he's there. The PA, PhD, PTA students and the Peace and Development and the Education Administration students, once again, isang mapayapang umaga sa ating lahat. With this, I would like to emphasize three things so that we can save the time. The first thing is, this is our first of its kind international webinar. As mentioned by Sir, the rationale behind is even pandemic, we can still move on. We can still level up our engagement in terms of discussing peace and development. Opportunity to engage with international peace. Yeah, welcome, Sir President. So I see the picture of our President. It is the opportunity for us to engage with the founder and an international peace advocate in the person of Dr. Swee-Hin. Later, she will be introduced on his profile. This one is very rare. It's a very rare opportunity for us to really engage with the founder of Peace and Development in the Philippines, Peace Education in the Philippines, and especially during the time of pandemic. So we're very thankful for accepting our invitation. That's opportunity to engage. Second is opportunity to learn and listen to the input of a first-hand information coming from the person in authority and the root of peace education in the Philippines. So for me personally, it is my first time to engage directly with the scholar, the international scholar, Dr. Several times, and many of the dissertations, most all of the dissertation, your name, sir, is mentioned in the literature. So we're very thankful because We have proven that we are really your admirers and companions. We can say companions or co-worker in peace and development. But this is also taking the opportunity my students to really concentrate on listening, and including realization and critical reflection on the inputs that will be given by our speaker. And third is me as a former external director of the CSU. I can still have in my mind my support, even I'm under secondment arrangement, and soon I will be back in the university. A few months remaining in my secondment arrangement. That I value this as continuation and enhancement of our programs on external and internationalization of program in the higher education. There is a program now that continuing internationalization program in the SUCs. And this is now the reality that we are now moving globally, and we are thinking, though the term for this acting locally and thinking globally, no? So now, not just thinking globally, but acting globally now because of the advent of this partnership. And soon, I would like to put in our notes that maybe in the near future we could have a partnership with Sir Dr. Swee-Hin in terms of peace building, because our programs in graduate college in CSU under the leadership of our beloved President Dr. Semadelna and the Dean of the Graduate Dr. Gabalon and still continue further the ways forward in having a memorandum so that we can continue the collaboration. It is a good opportunity for us to really strengthen the partnership, not only on delivering lectures, but also exchanging informations. And maybe the situation will subside in the soonest time. We could engage face to face in terms of international forum and even peace research. So with this, I take this opportunity to thank everyone and welcome everyone in opening this international webinar by way of saying padayon, continue the search for peace and engaging peace and living with peace and compassion. So by that, maraming salamat sa inyong lahat at sana'y mabuhay tayo.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nuruddin Salam, Professor of Peace and Development, Cotabato State University. At this moment, let us welcome Professor Sema G. Dilna, President, Cotabato State University, for his inspirational messages.
Hello. Good morning. Hello. Madam NC, marinig niyo ako?
Good morning, Doc.
At the outset, my courtesy and respect to the ever-active and enthusiastic Dean of the Cotabato State University Graduate School, Dr. Tarhata S. Gamalon. Yan na ba si Dean? Of course, the fully active program of the Graduate School Peace and Development Program, Dr. Alferez. The professor of this academic endeavor, Dr. Norodin Salam, been for his secondment at the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao in the Development Academy of Bangsamoro, and the former program head and former for external and international studies. Nandiyan si Dr. Salam is not only my colleague but my kalaro in basketball. Nandiyan si Dr. Of course, the students who facilitated or facilitating this webinar on peace and development in the Philippines in consonance with global peace and development. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and assalamu alaikum. I take this pride and honor to be part of this timely and essential webinar seminar on peace in the Philippines and for global peace. We have your distinguished lecturer or guest today, and who is very known and familiar with this activity or topic. And he will be introduced later. And he is very familiar and popular as a reference for peace and development, and very well known of his Fetters for Peace. You know, speaking of peace, some says it's not only an absence of war in a certain area, but it is a holistic situation wherein there is tranquility and serenity from economics, political, social, cultural, spiritual, as well as educational development in a particular area. In the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region and Muslim Mindanao, the Philippine government and the MILF has just concluded the Bangsamoro Organic Law as a vehicle or an agent of peace in southern Philippines between the government of the Philippines and the hierarchy of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, which on its third year of its implementation by 2021-2022. And we are hoping for its extension of the Bangsamoro Transition Authority in such a way that those unfinished programs that can be started very well can be put in place. And with this seminar today, our students coming from different agencies, I believe that most of the students are coming from different implementing agencies as well as educational institutions. I believe that our alumni trustee is here, a student of Peace and Development, Honorable Regent Ustad Saudi Abu Bakar, and the rest of his classmates were very much committed in pursuit of peace, not only in our institution, but in the other areas where we are living. This August is a celebration of the 54th Asian Global Celebration.
Nag-commute ka pa eh. Nag-commute.
This August is a celebration of the Asian founding anniversary way back in August 8, 1967. And as we all know, that the aim of these ASEAN countries is for peace and for global peace and development. And this calls peace and development will really sustain what is peace and development. As we have said, it is a holistic approach, a holistic aspects of life, a holistic pillars of life in which it is not only focusing on the absence of war, but it is in such a way that a quality life of our citizenship, our colleagues in our community will all feel freedom, autonomy, and the absence of poverty as the main indication of peace and development. With the right first day, the late or guest, I believe that our students would be awakened and aware of the different strategies and methods of dealing challenges and prospects, especially this time of pandemic, in which we cannot set apart the advocacy of peace and development, not only in our locality, but throughout the world, or for global peace and development. Our university, with its vision of being or aiming for a world-class education hub for sustainable, inclusive, as well as a transformative peace and development, I could say that by sooner or later, we would be a center of world peace and development in the world. And as well as our projects of halal, as well as Center for Peace and Development by Ustad Hatta Bilon. And with the support of the Commission on Higher Education, through the higher education on the context of Bangsamoro Organic Law of Director Maximo Alhibi, the focal person of Chairperson Honorable Prospero E. De Vera, we could say that sooner or later, we will be a center of peace and development, not only in the country, but worldwide. With that, I am congratulating each and every one of this course under Professor Dr. Norodin Salam for their efforts, and I hope that this would not be the last, but the beginning of advocacy of webinar seminar on peace and development during pandemics. And with that, thank you very much. And in behalf of the university, we welcome the lecturer of this seminar, as well as the participants. Mabuhay and wassalamualaikum.
Thank you very much, Professor Sema G. Dilna, President, Cotabato State University. And now, let us hear another inspirational messages. Let us all welcome Dr. Tarhata Giamalon, Dean, Cotabato State University, Graduate School.
Reverend Head.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. To our university president, the first university president, Dr. Semaji Dilna. To our peace development professors, we have here MP Dr. Susana Anayatin of the BTC, Dr. Jane Abdul, Dr. Nuruddin Salam, the president of the Bangsamoro Development Academy, Commissioner Dr. Abubakar Dagtumanong, Dr. Alano Kadil, and of course Dr. Dato Tobla, and also the chairperson of the program of the Peace Development Program, Dr. Arnold Alferez, and to our resources speaker, Dr. Swee-Hin, and to our dear students participants from different program, PhD Education, MAPD, PhD PD, and other program. And I am hoping that we are all doing well in our endeavors. Before anything else, I would like to commend the program head of the MAPD and PhD PD program, Dr. Jose Arnold Alferez, for spearheading this webinar on development of peace education in the Philippines in consonance with the global peace. May this activity provide us an opportunity or avenue, or shall we say, a safe zone to share our thoughts, ideas, and experiences. As we continue our fight with the COVID-19 pandemic, it is equally essential to continue our initial battles in winning peace in our community, bringing peace in our country, and inshallah, achieving the global peace. One thing I am sure proud of with our university is that we were one of the pioneering institutions in the region that offered peace education programs. Moreover, the offering of the peace education in the university and in the Philippines as a whole is one of the actions we need to seriously consider. In deeper sense, I would like you to reflect on the essence of peace in your personal level. How did you bring about peace to your family, to your co-workers, and to your classmates, and to the community? As a students of the CSU Graduate School, to all of you students and the peace advocates, may we continue to proliferate and radiate the loveliness and magnificence of this five-letter word, the PEACE, or what we call the peace. Okay? So with that, a pleasant good morning to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tarhata Diamalon, Dean, Graduate School, Cotabato State University. Thank you so much, ma'am. And now, the introduction of our resource speaker. May I call Ms. Maria Erlinda Villa, student coming from the Doctor of Philosophy in Peace and Development, Cotabato State University.
Good morning, everyone. My courtesies to the members of the faculty of Cotabato State University, to my fellow students. It is an honor to introduce to you our distinguished resource speaker for today's webinar, Dr. Swee-Hin.
It is clear that the world is not yet fully humane or peaceful. We still continue to experience these tragic symptoms of a cultural war. No matter how difficult or long it takes, talking is always better than fighting.
He's a zealot, he's a missionary. I mean, he is thoroughly, utterly, completely, totally committed to peace education and to doing peace and to making the world a more peaceful place. And he believes he can do it, he knows he can do it, and he's making believers of a whole lot of other people too, that it's not just him, but that each one of us can make a difference if we really commit ourselves.
I am deeply impressed with the man's humanity.
his unfaltering faith in our goodness as human beings, and his unfailing efforts to bring that which is good in all of us out in the open. Swee-Hin ended up working on his dissertation with me, which was a great privilege actually for me. He was very independent-minded. He knew exactly what he wanted to do. The peace education wasn't something that was recognized as something that's worth doing among us, the ordinary scholars and professors of education. So he, in a sense, opened up a new field.
It was his teaching strategies that really influenced me in my way of teaching. I think perhaps my motto and my philosophy of teaching is don't bore your students. And Swee-Hin never let us get bored because we're always doing these fun activities, pretending we're interviewing people or pretending we are street children or making rap songs to explain poverty in development.
Professor Swee-Hin of the University of Alberta, Canada, has won the 2000 UNESCO Prize for Peace Education. who was...
His receiving the UNESCO Prize as Peace Educator of the Year is an immense achievement. This is the Nobel Prize in Education, and he's right in there with people like Paulo Freire and the Stockholm Peace Institute and Mother Teresa.
We were quite excited. We thought, here's finally someone who works quietly, works patiently, works tirelessly. This man rarely sleeps. We were quite impressed because finally, that kind of a person gets recognition.
It all happened very quickly once he was diagnosed, and I was admitted to the University of Alberta Hospital.
I called everyone I knew all over the world and told them exactly the time of the operation. So we had First Nations people praying, we had Buddhists praying in Australia and in Malaysia. We had the nuns, the priests in the Philippines, and all the friends. He needs to do a lot more work for peace. That's how we interpreted the very fast recovery also that he had, because after 3 days in the hospital, he was sent home.
Let's all welcome the man behind the global citizenship education in the Philippines, a man with a big heart and mind, sending out a message to the world that peace education is important. Peace education plays indispensable role in peace building, and that peace education is one of the foundation stones for building a culture of peace in all levels of life. A virtual applause, please, for our esteemed resource speaker, Dr. Swee-Hin. Good morning, everyone. My courtesy. So that's all the way I introduce our speaker. May we all have a virtual applause for our esteemed resources speaker for today's webinar, Dr. Swee-Hin.
Thank you very much, Ms. Vilia, for your kind introduction. And I'd like to begin, of course, by expressing the greetings of peace from diverse faiths. Assalamu alaikum, shalom, namaste, amitofu, and all the indigenous peoples of the world in their spirituality will say greetings of peace to all our relations. I would like to also begin by thanking the President of Cotabato State University, Dr. Sema Dirna, for your kind introduction, and also to Dean Giamalon, also Dr. Salam, and all the other distinguished professors of Cotabato State University. And I'd like to, of course, mention Dr. Boots Cantalopes and also Dr. Susana Yatin, who have been very close friends and good colleagues in peace education from way back when we were at Notre Dame University, NDU. It's been about 35 years since my first commencement, if you like, in peace education work in Mindanao in the Philippines, especially at NDU. And in those 3.5 decades, I'm really very happy to note that peace education, peace and development studies have expanded and grew with the participation of so many universities, colleges, faculties in education, in public administration, and peace and development. And of course, I'd like to express my heartfelt thanks to all these graduate scholars of CSU, that 65 of you are now enrolled in peace and development. I think stands, it's a good reflection that peace and development studies and peace education continue to be very much a part of the development of quality education in Mindanao and in the Philippines. So I congratulate you all for your commitment to peace education and peace and development. I think in the speeches of President Dr. Dina and also Dean Camalon, as well as I think Lieutenant Colonel Beniaga, you mentioned that this is still a time of COVID-19, a pandemic that has really seriously affected and caused suffering to literally many millions of people around the world. And this hardship and suffering continues to this day, including in the Philippines. But despite that you're in the middle of a pandemic, that you continue to be resilient. And I think this webinar in peace and development and peace education is a signpost of your resilience. I know you have all, as graduate scholars, engaged in an activity which I will introduce as a part of my presentation today. I have a PowerPoint which I will show, and fairly early on I will request the scholars to, I think coordinated by Ria, to show the output of your preliminary activity, but I'll come to that a bit later. So without further ado, I'd like to now share my screen and also mention that as I go along, there will be opportunities for you to raise comments, raise questions, and engage in a dialogue with me and with everyone in this webinar, so that the 3 hour with you will be a mix of not just continuous talking on my part or lecturing on my part, but it's more of a dialogue with everyone here. So let me now turn to the PowerPoint, and I will share it now. Okay. So to begin with, I'd like to show some slides and some pictorials, which reminds us that our world today is full of contradictions and crises. On the one hand, there's been, of course, over the past number of centuries, accelerated industrialization and urbanization. There's also the phenomenon that we refer to as mass consumption and consumerism. And I think those various pictures reflect that phenomenon. And again, some pictures of how we consume and how some people say, I shop, therefore I am, kind of an identity of modern humanity. Of course, there are some, not all, human beings who do live in very luxurious accommodations around the world, houses, condominiums,
almost like palaces, high rises. And certainly in many parts of the world, some parts of the world, you have universities who have huge buildings, well-resourced classrooms, schools, even at the basic levels, can have a lot of equipment, smart classrooms, very small student numbers, and hospital facilities in some parts of the world are extremely advanced in technologies and resources. And of course, we are living in an age of advanced technologies, from all the jet planes and even now there's spacecraft that goes to different planets, and even some of the richest billionaires of the world have recently spent many millions to bring themselves flying to the edge of the Earth. Robotics is now in play in terms of manufacturing all kinds of products, computers, IT, to drones that can deliver pizzas, 3D printers, biotechnologies, and of course, artificial intelligence. But despite such material and technological progress and such unlimited economic growth and, if you like, boundless consumerism, we have to admit that humanity and our planet Earth are still suffering from cycles of armed conflict, militarization, and direct violence, so that even in the midst of COVID, there's wars going on, armed conflicts going on. Just recently, the last few moments, we've seen Afghanistan engaging in literally civil war. It's been ongoing now for 20 years, trillions of dollars spent in Yemen and in Ethiopia, Tigray, in the Congo. So we still have armed conflicts ongoing and militarization around the world. And this, of course, results in millions of refugees. The Rohingyas, for example, who had to flee from Myanmar, are living in the largest refugee camp in Bangladesh. We've seen violence and hatred that's committed through racism, through sexism, there's cyber bullying, there's domestic violence going on around the world, and of course violence even in schools and on the playground as well, and in sports. Okay. We continue to see the pervasive violations of human rights that results in, as I say, in refugee camps, in people fleeing on boats, in terms of human rights violations, in terms of repression of dissent. Torture still continues. And we do know that the gender gap continues. The human rights of women and other gender identities are increasing. And since 9/11, we've seen Islamophobia across the world that has resulted in the persecution and discrimination of people of Islamic faith. And recently, as you've seen in the US, beginning in the US with the All Blacks Live movement, just to remind everyone that Black people, Black Americans continue to suffer from racism despite the civil rights movement many, many years ago. We continue to see, despite the boundless consumerism that a number of human beings are able to engage in, given their resources, deepening poverty inequalities that affect the poor fisher folk, poor laborers, the poor fishermen, farmers. We have across the mega cities of the world informal settlements where people live in very difficult conditions, all crowded in those shacks and shanty towns. Homeless children sleeping on the streets, child laborers, millions of them. And in the factories of the world, many people, especially women, slave away in very low wages, very unsafe conditions. And in many parts of the world, classrooms are very crowded, and that makes quality education really virtually impossible or very difficult. We, of course, are faced now with environmental destruction and the ecological crisis, all different dimensions of pollutions and degradation of the soil, loss of biodiversity, the death of coral reefs,
depletion of fisheries, and of course now we have the climate change, the whole crisis of climate change. Just a few days ago, as you remember, the UN panel report issued another grave warning about climate change, which needs to be addressed, or else we are heading down the path of planetary and therefore destruction of humanity as well. But in terms of educating for peace, we also recognize that peace is not just on the outside, it's also inner peace. And we are seeing signs of that, a loss of inner peace that involves alienation and addictions of all kinds, from substance abuse to alcohol abuse, etc. All kinds of anxieties which really affect the inner peace of humanity. And so the crisis of contradictions that we are witnessing in our world today are really the challenges of transforming, if you like, a culture of violence in all its diverse forms to a culture of peace. And I know as President Dr. Dina mentioned, peace is not just the absence of war, it is multidimensional and complex, and therefore it's very holistic. That is why when we talk about the role of education, and this is where all of you as scholars and educators at Cotabato State University, education is truly indispensable in building a culture of peace. And that is why over many decades now, there are so many diverse fields of transformative education, whether it's education, international understanding, or peace education, or disarmament education, or human rights education, or values education. In some countries, it's referred to as moral education, development education, or perhaps you can call it as education for global and local justice, education for gender equality, and of course, ESD, education for sustainable development and sustainable futures. And most recently, we have the promotion of global citizenship education, or GCED, which is in the theme of this webinar. Peace education and global citizenship are linked together. So I'd like to then talk about global citizenship very briefly, because if you remember now, when global citizenship education was being promoted by former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon as part of his global first education initiative, he points out that we are no longer citizens just of one country. Citizenship is not just national or local. We are also global because we are very interconnected and interdependent with all other peoples in all the parts of the world. And so we need to embrace a common humanity. We're not just living on one island as a nation, if you like. We are all part of a common humanity. But it also means that as a global citizen, we do need these so-called 21st century competencies and skills. You call it, that includes cross-cultural communication, critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, the whole notion of multiple intelligences. So it's not just cognitive intelligence, it's also emotional, social, and all the artistic, creative intelligences should also be a part of our competencies for this and future centuries. We of course need to live together in peace, justice, and harmony with each other and across all nations. Otherwise, we continue to have conflicts and then the wars that leads to all the other problems that we talked about earlier on through the pictures. We need to seek global solutions to many of the problems of the world. Climate change, weapons of mass destruction, migration are all global problems. So we need a global connectedness to solve those problems. Most importantly, we should no longer think of citizenship as passive. For example, the idea that as a citizen, you get to, for example, vote the next government in elections every 4 or 5 years, and then you fall asleep, if you like. No, citizenship should be active, and therefore we need to always think about how do you improve policies and implement policies that will really benefit the well-being of all citizens. We need citizens who can participate actively and fully in all aspects of life: political, economic, social, cultural. And therefore, global citizenship education reminds us that we need to be effective global, but also local and national. So sometimes the word global may give the impression it's all about the global. But then if you think about it, if the local and national peace is not promoted and fostered, how can we also have global peace? So global and local and national peace are all interconnected and relate to each other. So in summary, global citizens, I can say, are empowered with the critical knowledge, values, principles, and skills competencies to engage in personal and social action for the building of a holistic, multidimensional culture of peace. And very briefly, when we talk about global citizenship education, I like to mention that there are actually different paradigms, not just one paradigm. For example, there is still a sort of neoliberal paradigm of global citizenship education, as opposed to a critical paradigm. And in a sort of neoliberal paradigm, there is a lot of focus on the 21st century skills, which I mentioned before. Yes, those skills are very important, but then those skills of creative thinking, problem solving, being able to have cross-cultural communication, they can also be used for unpeaceful outcomes. You need all those skills, for example, to build more deadly weapons of destruction. You need all those skills and apply to succeed in quote-unquote business. But what if that business actually results in inequalities, in human rights violations, in environmental destruction? Therefore, a critical paradigm will always say we do need those 21st century skills, but we need to make sure it is well integrated with the values and principles of human rights, of justice, of democracy, of sustainability, and all the other values and principles of building a more peaceful world. Otherwise, we can have all those skills, but we are still stuck, if you like, in the status quo of an unpeaceful world, of an unsustainable world, of an unjust world. Now, before I then move on to the next part of my session, I'd like now to invite the scholars to you engage in an activity, and the task I posed was to ask you what do you think are the major issues and obstacles to building a peaceful Philippines? And I think in your different groups, you all set about to come up with the ideas. And I think you have, if you like, a summary of your output. So I think it'd be good to hear that now from the scholars. So Ria, who will be sharing with us.
Morning, Doc.
Yeah.
Yes, Doc.
I will stop sharing. Okay, I will stop sharing, and then you can share those output, summary of the output. Okay.
So this now, sir, the output of the three programs. To start with, maybe here a reflection from the PhD Educational Administration on their input for the three activity.
Would it be possible to move to slide 5 and 6? Those are the summaries. Thank you.
Here, Doc.
Thank you.
In the interest of time, Sir Eric Benyaga, can we have a sharing about this output as well from the PhD PD?
Yes, if you can give a quick summary, yes, of the output, yes.
Especially this link. So the link is given is only for my okay? Thank you. And of course, I have here if you want to.
Ma'am Earl,
Yes, sir.
can we go to the last slide? Okay. So I think the participation or the output of our group here is on it starts on economic inequality. We determine three, no, from our group. Of course, we include unemployment, no, especially with this type of pandemic. Many establishments are closed. The scarcity of resources, of course, it also is related with this pandemic. Even in the absence of this pandemic, even before this pandemic, we really observed this scarcity of resources, and we could relate this with structural violence because a number of our indigents or IP people are not benefited, no, by these resources that is supposedly provided by the government. We also mentioned the scarcity or a problem on food and water security. Food security because there are certain periods where the government, no, has problems on supplies of rice. No, the water security would pertain to the what do you call this? The absence of water supplies in some other areas of the country, especially in the far-flung areas. You know, and then most of the, shall we say, victims or people who are not benefited by this water supply are again our indigenous peoples and again the people from the far-flung areas. And if I may jump to the environmental concerns, we determined, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, almost 10, the damaged ecosystem caused by, of course, human factors such as illegal logging, no, that somehow cause climate change. We have social injustice. No, again, we speak of the limited health services, especially in this time of pandemic. We place this Filipino mentality as a catch-all issue, no, that we can also consider as not only a perennial problem, but a problem ever since the Filipino people existed. Marginalization, emergency management, no, we are still coping up on how we are going, on how we manage crisis situation. Biased public service would pertain to the obvious or basic bias in the provision of government services. Again, we will revert back to the provision of resources. Of course, we include, and in this we admit, no, we are in the law enforcement sector, but we admit that there is really delay in the criminal justice system. Of course, when we go inside, no, the problem we are not pulling ourselves out of the issue, no, because we are part of the criminal justice system as a member of the law enforcement agencies. But sometimes the problem really is on the court processes, no, and on the correction system, no, where we can always say failure because our correctional institutions really failed to correct or reform people, no, who pass by their institution. The government stability circumstances, we provided the adaptability to problem on the adaptability to technological advancement. No, the explanation on this is that the technologies of other countries more advanced than us cannot be, or we cannot avail, no, of those development because it will not adapt on the existing technology of the Philippines because those technologies are more advanced than ours, no. And one of the aboard circumstance or factor that we include is the trapo, the traditional politicians, no. And if I may relate it with the inconsistency on government policies, the traditional politicians kasi of the good things, no, that of the good political system that we have, the problem now lies on how these traditional politicians interpret, no, the system, such as, of course, the constitution would provide that the winner or the winner during election will be the one, no, who has a majority of the vote. And the problem now is on how these politicians interpreted this provision because they will now, they will came up with dirty tactics, the political assassination, vote buying, and the rest. Of course, corruption. This is a problem ever since. Abuse of power that is related with traditional politicians, the inconsistent government policies or non-alignment, no, pertains to the non-consistency in the provision of government services. Somehow, rich people would will be benefited, no, by this is a painful fact that we observe in the Philippines, where rich people are the most to benefit, no, from government services, and poor people are, shall we say, on the bottom level, no, they are the last ones, no, to be benefited by this government services. Of course, we have human rights violation, no, that are anchored on poverty and homelessness, violations of civil rights, human trafficking. We cannot deny these things happening around, no, especially in Mindanao. No, we have the backdoor areas, in the Basilan, Sulu, Tawi-Tawi provinces. Right to health, no, this is related on the provision of government services. On the non-violence issue, we have the RIDO, Family Feud, no, the name, no, changes depending on the place, no. In the Cordillera, we have the tribal war. In Mindanao, they have this RIDO. As a whole, we call it a family feud. Security issues, no, of course, because of the advancement of technologies, we experience cyber crimes, the terrorism, no, insurgency. Although the Philippine government is now really focusing on ending the insurgency problem, and the availability, no, we say availability because of the instruments of crime are proliferating in the areas such as firearms, loose firearms, drugs, and many other instruments that criminals made use of to perpetrate their criminal activities. So I think that is a simple recap on our discussion pertaining this matter that I submit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Colonel Benyaga, I think, for summarizing in a concise way all the issues and problems and obstacles of peacelessness that you as a group of scholars have thought about over the last few days, and I'm very grateful for this presentation. I think you will see from all the different issues and obstacles that you raised, it has resonance with the global problems and issues of conflict and peacelessness around the world. So in that sense, what is happening in the Philippines is not unique only to the Philippines. But I'm happy that you were able to come up with this presentation. It gives me an idea of the work you've been doing, and I'm sure in your dissertations and research, you'll be focusing on many of these issues. So thank you again very much. Thank you. So let me go back to my slide, and I think I'm now okay. I think some of you may recognize this image of a flower with 6 petals, which when the work at NDU started, it wasn't a flower yet. It was more mechanistic. But when we did workshops in Fiji and in the South Pacific Islands, they said, why not make it more organic? Then they say, what would you suggest? And said flowers, because in Fiji and the South Pacific, there are many flowers. Everywhere you walk, there are flowers. And so we decided that instead of a mechanistic presentation, we would have a flower image of a culture of peace. And you can see the 6 petals there actually encompass overlap with many of the issues and problems you raised in your in the output that Lieutenant Colonel Benyaga put together on the basis of your discussions. So one petal is the dismantling culture of war. Living with justice and compassion is the second petal. Promoting human rights and responsibilities, a third petal, a third theme. A fourth theme, building intercultural understanding, respect, and solidarity. A fifth petal theme, living in harmony with the earth. And last but not least, sixth theme, cultivating inner peace. And I'd just like to mention here that these 6 themes are not, if you like, exclusive. Some of you may wish to have a flower with 8 petals, for example, or fewer petals, and slightly different descriptions of the themes. So it's really up to you to decide. But we found that when we presented this holistic framework of a culture of peace in different parts of the world, from Asia Pacific to Canada, Australia, the industrialized world, so to speak, and Africa, there was a sense that it does relate to many of the issues and problems that face in those different countries and regions. So we've continued to use this flower, but as I say, if you feel you wish to emphasize a new petal or a different way to word them, it is really up to you. So let me now turn to goals of peace education. So we have touched on citizenship, and we said that global citizenship, or I think more accurately, local citizenship, global and local citizenship, is linked to the goal of building a peaceful world. And so peace education is vital in that goal. So there are two questions, and some of you may be familiar with it through the readings on peace education. So first of all, how can education contribute to a critical understanding of the root causes? And I stress again, root causes, not the superficial causes of conflicts, violence, and peacelessness. at personal, interpersonal, community, national, regional, and global levels. So that sounds really complicated, but I think life is complicated. Peacelessness occurs at all levels of life, from the very personal, interpersonal, community, to the broader national, regional, and international global levels of life. But the root causes are very critical, because if we do not understand the root causes of conflicts and violence, how are we going to overcome? Will the solutions we propose for addressing a problem really deal with it? It's a bit like in medicine. If you don't know the root cause of a particular illness, you could be recommending therapies or drugs or strategies which will not really get at the root cause of that illness. So in a similar way, we really have to always ask ourselves, what are the root causes of this or that conflict and problem? Then accompanying question then would be, how can education simultaneously cultivate values and attitudes that will encourage individual and social action for building a more peaceful selves, families, communities? I think I haven't quite shared. I'm sorry. That's better. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Okay. So I'm sharing so these are the goals of peace education. First of all, understanding the root causes, and after that, how do we move to the individual and social action for peace building, again at all levels of life. Then, before we move to the themes, each of those themes or petals, I'd like to mention that GCED and of course peace education have very vital pedagogical dimensions or principles. It's not just about understanding why or the content, the cognitive knowledge of the problems and the conflicts and obstacles. We have to remind ourselves, as UNESCO says, learning is cognitive, yes, but it's also social emotional, because we are social emotional human beings. But most importantly, we need to behave. We need to put into action what we believe in, what we committed. Otherwise, it's just academic. You may understand a problem, but you say, well, I have nothing to do with the solution. Then we are not putting into action and trying to resolve the problem and to transform peacelessness into peace. And as Paulo Freire, the Brazilian adult educator, has reminded us, education cannot be banking, which for a long time has been a dominant mode of education. You bank all kinds of expert knowledge into the minds of learners, and then you tell them, produce it. We set you an exams. So that is a banking kind of education. It doesn't promote critical thinking and critical awareness. And I think he also points out, as others have looked at education systems around the world, we can have educational systems which are very hierarchical and very competitive, over-competitive. And so the idea of education or going to school is to succeed, get all the best marks and so on, and move up the ladder until you get into higher levels of education. And then hopefully you also get good jobs. So that kind of education, I think, is not going to help build a more peaceful world. On the contrary, some of that kind of education can actually result in peacelessness, into people acting unpeacefully, applying their knowledge to unpeaceful actions and conduct. And so in peace education and GCED, we should think about some critical principles and dimensions. So for example, the principle of holism. So knowledge is holistic. Therefore, we can't just talk about a problem as though it's economic. An economic problem is also political, it's also social, it's also cultural, it's also spiritual. Secondly, we need dialogue, so that as I'm sure you're doing in your peace and development studies, your professors are not simply engaging in one-way education, one-way teaching, and you simply learn what they teach. It's dialogical. So you also have your ideas, your experiences to share with the teacher, educator, professor, and engage in a dialogue. Because or else you assume that the teacher or professor knows everything and is the expert in everything. every one of us, even the youngest learner who have come from wherever their homes and families, communities, have knowledge about their lives and some understanding of why they're living in that way. Then the principle of values formation is to point out that knowledge is never values free. Even science is not values free. And so it's about formation of values which will promote peace and well-being of everyone, not just human beings, but also our environment and planet Earth. And last but not least, the principle of critical empowerment. Knowledge is to be empowered to act, to take action, to transform. Otherwise, we are disempowered. We become passive. We become paralyzed. All the knowledge has not helped us to move forward. And of course, to be empowered is also to be courageous, because to overcome obstacles, we need patience, courage, of course, critical thinking as well, and to work out strategies to build a more peaceful world through peaceful strategies and non-violent strategies. So just here a diagram to reflect those 4 principles, and they're all interconnected: holism, dialogue, values formation, critical empowerment. Just to go back to dialogue, that means when we engage in educating for peace, as I'm sure you all do, we try to have the very creative pedagogies that brings in the arts. We sing songs, we compose songs, we engage in role plays, and so on and so forth. So it's not just simply the talk and chalk lecturing kind of education. Everyone is involved and participate. Artwork, and stepping into the shoes of those who are not us, in order to develop a sense of empathy and compassion and solidarity. So I'd like now to, as I mentioned to Ria, it'd be good to have a conversation as we go along. But before I move to the specific themes, I'd like now to invite some thoughts and questions at this point. And then after that, we'll move again back to the PowerPoint. So please, any comment at this stage, any question, any disagreements with what I've said, please. Is there anyone who like to share? Just look at the chat. Okay. Yes, from Professor Abubakar Datumano. It says, injustice is a key factor in many conflicts. An important question relating to the relationship between peace and justice is the nature of peace. So the question is peace inextricably linked to justice? What relationship is there between peace and justice? How do they intersect? Furthermore, is total justice needed before you can achieve the peace, or peace is a process? So the first question, how is peace related to justice? As I will, I think, show in greater detail later, we can use the proverb, if you like. There can be no peace without justice. And because when there are injustices, inevitably there are conflicts. And those conflicts can sometimes even result in armed conflict in terms of wars and militarization. Therefore, if we do not live in a just world, we are not living in peace. In fact, you can have a society where there are no wars, no armed conflicts. But if there are injustices, if people do not receive even their basic needs of food, clean water, sanitation, basic housing, literacy, healthcare, how can they wake up in the morning and say, I'm at peace? Therefore, definitely justice and peace goes hand in hand together. But the argument, the question is, do you need total justice before you can achieve true peace? I think it's a process. It's a process. Justice doesn't immediately become fruitful in all dimensions of life all at once. People have to work at different kinds of injustices, social, cultural, political, economic injustices, and try to overcome them in their own context. And by doing that, you can say the society has become more peaceful, but you wouldn't say that it is totally peaceful. So for us, building a peaceful world is a process. So I hope, Dr. Abu Bakar, I have clarified a bit. And I think later on there will be a more detailed examination. Thank you. Any other a follow-up comment from Dr. Abu Bakar? I think how would relate to the context of the Bangsamoro aspiration of true peace and achieving justice? I think certainly when you look at the peace agreement, the Bangsamoro peace agreement with the government, I think that's a big step forward, because way back when we started peace studies education NDU, we were still in the middle, if you like, of the conflict. There was armed conflict. And of course, many people also suffered greatly, and there was insecurities, and as a result, also people could not farm and meet their basic needs in peace. Therefore, I think the Bangsamoro aspiration for peace is very important. But how I would look forward to how the Bangsamoro government, as it moves along, will be implementing justice, because as I will point out later, there are different paradigms of development in the world. So what kinds of paradigms of development will actually achieve more justice than some other paradigm of development? Okay, I think thank you. And from Hasim Tasil, there can be no peace without justice, or vice versa. I agree. Okay. So perhaps I'll move on then to thank you for this opportunity to interact a bit. And I'd like now to move to the first theme. And again, I'll stop at different points to allow more conversation and dialogue. So let us look first of all at the theme of dismantling a culture of war. I think this is where it's so important to prevent and resolve armed conflicts and wars. Whenever they are happening, we need to resolve them. Therefore, when there is conflict that involves governments or armed groups, we need to think of how do we bring the different sides to peace talks. And from peace talks, how to move towards disarmament and eventually peace building and integration of everyone who's been involved in a conflict into civil society. I think that is the challenge whenever we have armed conflict. And if you look now at what is happening in Afghanistan after 20 years, the war and armed conflict did not really stop, and therefore, as a result, we have we are seeing now many thousands of people displaced as the fighting intensifies. So it's a great need for disarmament education to persuade all citizens to say we should not have wars, we should armed conflicts, we should encourage peace processes. And I know this was happening in Mindanao over the decades until you have the, I think, very fruitful peace agreement between the MLF and the government. We also need to have a process by which militarization is the real scourge on humanity. Not just nuclear. The nuclear Holocaust is still potentially with us. There's still many thousands of nuclear weapons in the world. And over time, the nuclear powers continue to develop, if you like, more deadly, more smaller weapons. That's even now militarization of space. And of course, there are some other governments that says, nations that say we should also have nuclear weapons to defend, quote unquote, ourselves. But the more nuclear weapons are produced in the world, the more countries become nuclear armed. Then we potentially we can even have an accidental nuclear confrontation. But of course, the nuclear powers really have to step back and say, if you say that country shouldn't have nuclear weapons, but what about yourself? What about yourself? Are you willing to also give up nuclear weapons? So that's why the UN Nuclear Arms Treaty to abolish nuclear arms, of course, those countries that had nuclear arms did not sign it. But nevertheless, I think it's a step forward to show that many nations and peoples of the world saying there should be no nuclear arms, and therefore the potential Holocaust of nuclear war is abolished forever. But even without nuclear weapons, putting that aside, conventional armaments is a terrible indictment on humanity, because arms are being produced, arms are sold through the arms trade, legal or illegal. And what do arms do? They're used for wars, they're used for armed conflicts, and countries which should be spending their limited budgets on social needs, basic needs, on food, clean water, education, healthcare, spending even more on their arms expenditures and borrowing money as well to do it. So how do we have a way in which security can be promoted in a culture of peace? And I think these are all challenges for all sections of the armed forces and the police forces in any country. So I know there's been violent extremism as recent in different parts of the world. I think Mindanao is no stranger to that. You had the siege of Marawi, and so the need to prevent violent extremism, PVE, is crucial. And I know there's been research going on by different groups in Mindanao to look into the root causes of violent extremism. And it's very complicated. There are push factors, there are pull factors, and the response to violent extremism then cannot be simply, quote unquote, military, simply a means of wiping out violent extremism. If the root causes remain, then violent extremism will continue to simmer away and even grow. So I would hope that your research at CSU will also involve looking at, I'm sure you're looking at violent extremism and how to prevent and overcome the root causes. So in general, Education for Peace and GCED needs to bring in conflict resolution, education, and transformation in all levels of schooling. And this includes, for example, the very successful programs of peer mediation. In different parts of the world, young children are educated to be mediators. And so then their task is to observe, and if they witness their fellow students beginning to engage in conflicts that might even become violent, they mediate. They bring the different parties to a peace table in the school and get them to explain why they're in conflict and how it can be resolved peacefully. That's I think, if it can be encouraged in all schools, that's very crucial. And conflict resolution strategies should also become a part of adult life, because conflicts are always a part of life. Conflicts happen in workplaces, happens in families, and so if we have peace education promoting conflict transformation, I think they'll be very helpful to building a peaceful world. I know in the past, across the Philippine zones of peace have been promoted. I think they're not so obvious now, but I think they still pointed out that when you have armed conflict, if it's possible to develop at least a zone of peace, then within that zone of peace, the communities are not faced with being caught, if you like, in the middle of the armed conflict. But those are very challenging initiatives. In schools, bullying is a problem now across the world. There's bullying going on, not just physical bullying, but also cyberbullying. And so school programs need to encourage and all students to understand the whole problem of bullying. The principle of no tolerance or zero tolerance is simply say, if I catch a bully, I punish the bully, and sometimes even send them away from the school. But then if they go somewhere else, they will continue. So we need a process of educating the person engaged in bullying action. Why? And it's been shown those students who engage in bullying in school, they could be suffering from at home, in terms of violence at home, and they're bringing that into the school. So we need a process of helping people understand why bullying happens, and then the whole issue of onlookers. When people witness bullying happen, they should not simply shut their eyes or pretend it's not happening. They have to play an active role in also overcoming the bullying. Then when you look at media, nowadays, as you know, there's a lot of violence being promoted in media, including now social media. There are many websites that promote violence of all kinds. violence against women, violence against people of color, and there's also violence through video games. There's even television programs, very popular television programs in Philippine media. I had the opportunity to watch, to find out what's happening in Provinciano, for example. It's a very popular program, right? But when I look at different episodes of Provinciano, I wonder, what is it really promoting? There's a lot of violence in Provinciano, and you have to wonder why sometimes rule of law is not followed either. But the hero is a hero because he's able to eliminate, if you like, the enemies or the bad guys. But that would give the impression, I think, to those who watch it, the young would say, when we have conflicts, using violence to overcome eliminate the bad guys is the way to go. But that would not be good in terms of their consciousness and in terms of becoming adults and approaching conflicts that they can be involved in. And last but not least, violence in sports now is becoming a more serious problem around the world. Sports can be very competitive, and even in North America, for example, parents who want their children to succeed, win the game, they can even become violent to the coaches of the opposite team. And so when we look at sports, what's supposed to be friendly, like in the Olympics, sports personship, it shouldn't be about engaging in violence in order to win at all costs. So that's the theme of dismantling a culture of war. And I'd like now to open up the space again for participants to raise a comment or question on this theme. Yes, I think one comment, I think very important one. From Dr. I don't see the full name there, but I think a faculty member. Why is transitional justice not being popularized? Yes, I think that transitional justice, thank you for this reminder, is a process by which when we look at justice, it is not retributive justice, but transitional justice. So this allows for reconciliation. This allows for those who are involved in injustices to realize that what they have done is unjust and violent, and so the resolution of that would be a way by which the perpetrator of justice actually begins to transform himself or herself. So if you think of the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that were undertaken, for example, the end after apartheid, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in which those who had committed acts of violence and human rights violations towards the victims of apartheid actually admitted their actions, their guilt in front of the relatives of the family of those who had suffered or died from the violations of human rights. And as a result, there was reconciliation, but the system also, when in terms of truth and reconciliation, is also about justice. Therefore, there is also a sense, can there be some compensation as well? So yes, it's very important to have transitional justice. And here I would like to just add the note in terms of indigenous methods of resolving problems and conflicts. There is a transitional component there. So in Australia, Canada, for example, Australia, indigenous peoples, when there is a conflict within the community and there's an act of injustice done, what happens is that it's not just the normal, established court system which sentences them and sends them thousands of miles away to be incarcerated, but rather the community elders are involved, those who have suffered are involved, and there is an admission of responsibility on the part of the perpetrator, and there is some process by which they show they are they admit their responsibility, and they continue to stay in the community to contribute to the well-being of the community. Okay. So that's my comment to our professor there. There is another from how do we bring justice big armed conflicts? Well, I think this is where I think I mentioned it just now. It's very important. I think I believe the victims of the martial law it took a long time, but there was a process by which some of them were able to get compensation for what happened to them. Now, of course, for those who have lost their relatives, you can never bring back the relative, but then there's some kind of compensation. I might mention something that happened not too long ago. The actual incident happened nearly 20 years ago in Nigeria, where the Ogoni people were saying to the oil company like Shell, do not destroy our land. We're not benefiting from it. We're having tremendous pollution. And the Ogoni Nine, led by Ken Saro-Wiwa, protested, and the Nigerian government of the day said they are creating problems, and they were sentenced to death, and they were executed. And it took another 17, 18 years before the families were able to bring the case to the courts. And as a result, Shell said they did not actually admit the responsibility, but they say, given the suffering that has been done to the family, we will compensate them with several $1 million. So that doesn't fully address the whole issue of justice that happened, but it does have that notion of at least some compensation. Okay. Now let me see. Okay, I think yes.
Alam mo, pretty talaga ang pag-invest.
Who is there respond to what I've said? Okay, then perhaps we'll move on to the other comment here, and this is from Dr. Pantelopes, good friend. What are your thoughts about the West Philippine Sea conflict? Countries and nuclear weapons are there. Well, the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, of course, is an area of conflict and tension. And obviously, we should not have any attempted resolution of the conflict that results in nuclear war. I don't think any of the countries with nuclear powers involved in the conflict really want nuclear war. Nobody wants nuclear war, because in the end, you're looking at the Third World War. But the point about the West Philippine Sea conflict is there's been over time, as you know, the militarization by one power, in this case China, of many of the atolls and the coral reefs. And this militarization is not good for the stability and the well-being of all the nations and peoples in the region. And so it's so important that the Philippines, together with other affected countries in the ASEAN region, to be able to join hands and indicate that the whole area, South China Sea, cannot be simply decided by one country who say the dash line is ours, because, as you know, that has already been rejected by the International Tribunal. And then, of course, the West Philippine Sea, you have the rights under the law of the sea to that territory, and therefore there should be no incursion. There should be no taking away of, for example, fish resources of the Philippines. I was really surprised when I tried to buy pampano here, and one of the shops says, this is pampano from the Philippines. But when I look at the package, it's made in China. So, of course, pampano swims everywhere. But the point is, there are certainly trawlers especially from China, that are now in your territory fishing away. And I think your fisher folk are suffering because of that. They're catching less fish. So definitely it's a valuable resource for any country. Fish grows wild in the sea. Marine resources should be your right to have access to those resources without being bullied or without pressure being brought on you. So that's my comment on the West Philippine Sea to the question of and the further follow-up is how should it be approached? Well, I think what I've said is we need to understand the rights of countries within the context of the law of the sea. but at the same time, we also have to ask policies of any nation in terms of protecting your own natural resources. And for a country of 7,000 islands, the Philippines, the fisheries should be really well developed. You have so much sea, oceans around you, and fish and other marine resources are vital to life. And so if you protect them, fish will not be so expensive. I don't see why galunggong is so expensive in the Philippines and why you're actually importing galunggong. So, and over the centuries, decades, galunggong has really become a very expensive fish when it should not be, given galunggong is in your seas and oceans. Okay, so it's a question of justice, it's a question of international law, it's a question of human rights. That doesn't mean, though, that the Philippines is trying to go to war with China. No, I think if you can gather together in the ASEAN community and put more diplomatic pressure on China and have allies from other parts of the world who can understand the logic of your argument and who would also agree that you have a right to your own resources and who would wish the South China Sea to be neutral, to be a sea where all countries can pass by freely. And of course, their resources, so then if they exploit it, they should be shared equitably. Although in terms of environmental issues, digging up the South China Sea for more fossil fuels, I think in terms of climate change is also a problem. Okay. So I'll leave it at the moment for that, in terms of that question. Okay, thank you. From Nais Yusuf, human rights violations. Can we leave that for the next theme? I think we're going to look at human rights. So I will respond to that in terms of Rohingya and the refugee crisis. Again, from Professor Abu Bakar to Tumanong, extremism act include violations of human rights and rule of law. Understand that there are no universally accepted definition of violent extremism, even among institutions such as the United Nations. So let me see the rest of the, okay. Even among UN and so on, okay. European Union. Okay, how do you see the action of Israel against Palestine recently, where even the victims are non-combatants, including children and women? Okay, the first issue of defining violent extremism. I think there's enough understanding that violent extremism is extremism. Well, if there is extremism that leads to violence, you can say that leads to violent extremism. But what is most important, I think, is understanding the root causes of so-called violent extremism. And if we look at the root causes in terms of push and pull factors, it becomes complex, but then it becomes very holistic. For example, if you say, if some youth, children recruited to violent extremist groups, what are the root causes of that? Then in terms of the research that's been done, I think in the Philippines or elsewhere, it also has to do with injustice. So if people don't have enough food, don't have employment, then to be recruited is one way to get food and to have some kind of income to meet their basic needs. That's just one factor in terms of the push factor. The poverty and hunger can lead people to be recruited more easily. But on the other hand, it can also be has to do with political ideologies, has to do with the approach taken by powerful countries in terms of regime change, for example. So if you think of what has happened in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen, how did they become strengthened and strong? Then you have to understand it has to do, it all began, if you like, with the US saying, it's part of the Cold War, so the Soviet Union is there, we need to remove them. And in order to do that, we will support the aid and support the growth of the Mujahideen. And of course, out of that, you also then have the emergence of the Taliban, who in turn then also gave some support to Al-Qaeda. Therefore, we need always to go back to the root cause of any particular conflict. And when you talk about terrorism, again, we need to be holistic. So countries that are concern about terrorism have often, a number of countries have often focused on terrorism committed by non-state groups, but they would rather not talk about state terrorism. And that is why if we think of the Israel-Palestine issue, clearly there's enough evidence to show that Israeli policies towards the Palestinians over so many decades have resulted in grave violations of their human rights. And then in terms of conflicts, the use of force in a way that, as you pointed out, results in the death and injuries to many children and women. Okay, so if we have a holistic view of terrorism, then we don't fall into, if you like, into a view of terrorism which only identifies non-state actors. Governments and states have over time engaged in all forms of terrorism against not only their own people, but also against others in other parts of the world. So just to engage in regime change because one particular leader is no longer your friend, then you engage in interventions which then result in all forms of violence, bombings, and killings of even the innocent civilians in that country in order to bring about the rise of a new regime which is then your friend. Okay. Okay. So I think I will move on to the next theme, and there will be, I think, an opportunity to revisit the earlier themes. So let us then move on to living with justice and compassion, or another way to put it is how do we build global and local justice. I think the realities of global poverty and hunger is well known to all of us, so I will not go into great details about the lack of food and of clean water and sanitation and housing and healthcare. And these inequalities exist within and across nations, so that even though the richest, most industrialized countries do have poverty and hunger, of course, a smaller percentage. There's homelessness in North America, there's hunger in North America, there's even children who are malnourished in North America and in many other advanced industrialized countries. So inequalities do happen even within rich nations. But across nations, we see this big divide between global North and global South countries. And if you look at the reports of Oxfam, the international NGO, its data now, the past number of years, really translates into the title, an economy for the 99%. That is, the current global economy is benefiting the richest 1% of the world. And the 99%, of course, within that, the lowest 30-40% are really deprived in terms of their basic needs. But in between that, there are also levels of deprivation as well and inequalities. And COVID-19 has really highlighted this global divide. Because we have seen now that in countries that are affected by COVID-19, the poor have been the most affected in terms of access to healthcare, in terms of when employment happens, there's lockdowns and they cannot work. So COVID-19 has accentuated global inequalities. And as it continues, we're actually going to witness more hunger and malnourishment in the world, in different parts of the world, especially in the global South. So these are just indicators, one from the World Bank to show the gross disparities of consumption in the world. Back to Oxfam, again, the pie chart shows where the richest 1% controls nearly 50% of the world's resources. If you think of the CEO of Virgin Atlantic and also Jeff Bezos of Amazon, recently they flew to the edge of the earth, and it costs $30 million or $25 million just to get a seat on that kind of flight, while people are really suffering from malnutrition and lack of healthcare and dying from COVID-19. And of course, vaccines, when you think about vaccines, there is this big vaccine gap. That is, the majority of the world's vaccines that produced are really bought and by the rich countries because they can afford it. And the poorer countries have far fewer vaccines in order to meet the COVID crisis. Okay. UNICEF has this indicator that 29,000 children age of 5 die every day. And they're estimating that more and more children will die from preventable causes, from hunger, malnutrition, from diseases that are preventable if they have basic needs. And the 168 million child laborers are laboring away, producing, not in school, not getting healthcare, nutrition, but virtually working as slave labor. And so therefore, when you look to peace education and GCED or other kinds of transformative education, we need to understand the different paradigms of development. It's no good just saying our country is developing. We are showing signs of economic development, even though COVID has affected us. So that's why when you look at one dominant paradigm of development and globalization, we can call it modernization or liberal and neoliberal paradigm development, or globalization from above, or corporate-led globalization. And a number of key assumptions here. So very quickly, first of all, development is quote-unquote about growth. So the more growth you have, the more growth in GNP, that's wonderful. So the higher the growth, then you are developing, quote-unquote. If you are quote-unquote developing, it is because, or you're less developed, it's because you lack capital, you lack expertise, knowledge, you lack infrastructure, even lack values. So we need people who have the values of being entrepreneurial, individual entrepreneurship, etc. And you should be integrated in this globalized economy. The more integrated you are, the more able you are to benefit from the global growth. You're able to sell more, export more of your products or your resources, and therefore you can climb the ladder of quote-unquote development. So the industrialized quote-unquote developed countries are the role model for development. You look at them and say, one day I will be like them. One day I'll be like US. One day I'll be like Japan. One day I'll be like Western Europe. So that's our goal. That's our goal development. Economic development means to follow in the footsteps of those who are already, quote unquote, developed. And they're going to help the developing countries by trade, by aid, by investments, through the World Bank, through the IMF, through the World Trade Organization, and most importantly, through the transnational corporations. They are the ones who can bring investments to your country. They have the knowledge, the know-how, they're connected to the rest of the world market, and through that you will grow. So that's the dominant paradigm of development and globalization. I'd like to make a footnote here, because in this paradigm development, they distinguish between developed countries and developing countries. Before we used the term less developed, but it became unpopular because it's somehow seen as negative. Now, when you say a country is quote-unquote developed, you are in a way implying that they develop in everything. Okay, you're actually in a way saying that developed is not just economic. There are more cars, more electricity, more advanced technologies, high income. Are you also saying that they are more developed culturally? Okay, they are more developed spiritually. They have more wisdom. Now, if you say no to that, then why do you say they developed? Are you saying your own culture is not also developed compared to them? Are you saying your spirituality, your wisdom is quote unquote less developed than Americans or Japanese or Western Europeans or Canadians? I refuse to go that way. So that's why I think we should, for me, in terms of a peace educator, let us rename countries in a way that is more accurate. So I would rather say global north and global south. Global north countries, I agree, are more industrialized. Yes, they have more consumer goods, they have higher economic income, but they are not necessarily wiser, they're not necessarily more culturally developed. They don't have all the spirituality of the world. This doesn't mean they don't have, but compared to poor farmers, fisher folk, people who are living at the margins of the economy, it doesn't mean they have no wisdom. It doesn't mean they have no values. It doesn't mean they have no spirituality. It doesn't mean they have no compassion. It doesn't mean they're not helpful to neighbors who are in trouble, and so on. Therefore, from a peace education perspective, I'd rather that we use terms like global north and global south, rather than developed and developing. But that's my view. So when we talk about the root causes of global poverty and hunger, I know Lieutenant Colonel Berniagachi mentioned the term structural violence. And that's a very key concept in peace education and GCED. Structural violence, of course, means there are unequal economic and social structures, relationships, and systems, which means that global resources are not distributed fairly or justly. Indeed, there is enough resources in our planet today to meet the basic needs of all humanity, all human beings, but only if production and distribution of those resources are fair and just. When there is injustice, then you end up with, as the Opsan figure shows, a majority of human beings lack even their most basic needs. Therefore, we need to overcome structural violence to build a more peaceful world. And this brings us back to the question raised earlier on by Professor Abu Bakar. There can be no peace without justice. So even in the absence of war and armed conflicts, if there is structural violence, then we have an unpeaceful society and world. So when we look then at the most powerful agencies here, the transnational corporations, increasingly they are controlling all kinds of economic processes in the world, economic systems. And this includes even food. The most basic food are being controlled by the largest agribusiness corporations of the world. And this ends up undermining food security, so that the poor farmers of the world, no matter how hard they work, they're not producing enough food to feed themselves and the rest of their own citizens. And the agribusiness corporations of the world engage in capital-intensive agriculture that is also very chemical pesticides, fertilizers are very polluting. And this in turn leads to environmental destruction. And when they encourage poor farmers to engage in cash crops, produce this or that so you get more profits, what has happened in different parts of the world, this so-called green revolution has resulted even in suicides of poor farmers, because having borrowed heavily, something happens to the crops, pesticides, bad weather, and they cannot repay it. So that leads them to suicide. So in India, there are many thousands of poor farmers who have committed suicides under this dominant paradigm of agriculture. So I'd like to also, of course, hear from you in terms of poor farmers in the Philippines. When we look at the manufacturing side, the global assembly line, of course, produce all kinds of manufactured goods for exports cheaply, because the labor is cheap, resources available in those countries, natural resources. But the trouble is the brand names of the world, the corporations that have brand names, they produce those goods very cheaply through labor that is not unionized. They're very poor working conditions. They pay very little. But when they sold as brand name products in North America, in Western Europe, Australia, Japan, they fetch very high prices because of brand names. And so as a result, the poor workers who produce those brand names actually don't benefit from the high prices of those brand name products. So that's why it is unethical conduct, and there's a lot of campaigns now on those sorts of corporations to improve the working conditions of the laborers who work in those global factories. But when we talk about foreign investments and transnational corporations, they're only in countries because they're allowed to by the national governments, by the local elites, by the national elites, who also cooperate with them and therefore also benefit. At the same time, the international financial institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO have preference for the dominant paradigm of development. And as a result, there is, if you like, a culture of over-consumerism, but it's available only to a minority of the world's population. And this is, I think, at the expense of majority who lack even their basic needs. And later on, when we look at the environment, this over-consumerist paradigm of economic development actually intensifies the climate change crisis. I'll talk more about it later. And therefore, in peace education, in GCD, we need to rethink development. Is there an alternative paradigm of development? And this is an acronym that we've been using for some time now, PEACE, peace. So the first P stands for participatory, which is to say, when decisions and policies are made about what kind of development, the people should be, the grassroots should participate in the decision making. Otherwise, perhaps the policies of development actually end up hurting the people. It may not benefit the people. It benefits only a few. So how do people participate? I think it's very important that they have consent to development and that the grassroots organizations, civil society organizations, NGOs all have a critical role to play in looking at any development policies and programs that are being put forward by relevant government agencies, by international organizations and corporations. The first E is equitable, and that's to say, as I mentioned again, how can it be peaceful development if it leads to increasing the gaps between the rich and poor? And those of you who had a chance to look at the writings of the present Pope Francis, if you look at all his writings on development and globalization, that is what he points out. It is not moral. It is not humane development. It's a globalization that leads to increasing the gaps between the rich and poor. And in the most recent meeting of the World Bank, I think he sent a message to them, which actually pointed that out very clearly, that we cannot have business and corporations conducting themselves in unethical and in profit maximizing ways that leads to a majority of people's not meeting even their basic needs. Appropriate is to say it's a development that has to be appropriate in values and technology. If you have very advanced technologies in a development, you end up becoming dependent on those who have the spare parts, who have the knowledge to even to repair your products and to buy it from them to begin with. So appropriate is also intermediate technologies that are appropriate for your situation. The second E is ecological sustainability. So I think I've said a lot about that. Development has to be sustainable. And later on, when we talk about climate change, we have to ask, why is climate change continue to, change in a way that is leading to this grave situation that humanity is facing. And last but not least, C, critical empowerment, which is to say, in a peace paradigm development, people are empowered to take action, to take social action, of course, peaceful, non-violent action, to challenge policies which result in the loss of their well-being, in terms of their basic needs not being met, and also environmental destruction. So a good case of that is mining. So all over the world now, there's mining carried out by the most powerful mining corporations. Many countries engage in mining because they think, well, by selling off your minerals, you will get some return. You sell it, so you get some profit. But the problem with mining, of course, we know land-based mining is very ecologically destructive, no matter how many provisions you make for sustainable mining. And at the same time, it also displaces indigenous peoples. And all over the world, there's been indigenous peoples who are standing up to say, we have signed the International Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but we're not given a free and informed consent. Because we have looked at it, and this mining project will actually lead to further economic destruction and also cultural destruction as well. It is development aggression, not peaceful development. So that's an alternative peace paradigm development that in peace education and GCD we should be considering. So in terms of actions, if you think of learners, when they learn about alternative paradigm development, they begin to develop a sense of empathy and solidarity for those who are poor and marginalized. They get involved in NGOs, they get involved in civil society organizations, they can write petitions to government, they can ask their local politicians all the way from councillors to governors to mayors to members of Congress to senators to the president to ask what kind of development policies are going to bring about real benefit to everyone, not just to a few. When we talk about giving aid, it should not be pity, it's really solidarity, because someone who has funds can say, well, I'm giving you because I can afford to give you something for your basic needs. But then they don't ask what the other hand is doing. Perhaps the other hand is actually involved in why people are poor in the first place, why they lack their basic needs in the first place. So it should be solidarity. You can involve your youth and children in youth clubs, UNESCO clubs and projects. And nowadays we have so-called fair trade, so that trading can become more fair in the world, with trading in coffee or in other products of the world, clothing. It doesn't really move, transform the whole paradigm, but it's a step forward. I think it's saying that when we have trade, it should be fair and just, not unequal trade.
Recording stopped.
Do you hear me? I heard a recording stop. Okay. Controlling the power of corporations, debt cancellation, rethinking quantity to quality of life, I think is very important. That's why Bhutan, as you know, as a country, has said, forget about gross national product. We are going to promote gross national happiness as an indicator of progress in our country. And what does that mean? It involves not just, of course, basic needs are met, but it's also about environmental sustainability. Okay? So gross national happiness is one example, or the orthodox gross national product. In fact, if you think about it, if there's environmental destruction, your GNP can increase. Why? Because you are going to repair the damage. And when you do that, then you are adding to the gross national product. But it doesn't make sense, right? So gross national happiness says no environmental destruction. There should be basic needs should be met. There should be social justice. Because there should also be human rights of everyone should be promoted. Okay, and last but not least, the idea of corruption. I know one of the problems you mentioned in your discussion among the students is corruption as a problem. This happens all over the world. Even the industrialized countries have corruption. But of course, in the global south countries, it's a high level, and as a result, budget and funds which should go to meet the basic needs of citizens are actually pocketed by corrupt members of government or politicians or business elites. And therefore, peace education should also work at promoting and fostering clean governance, clean government. There should be no corruption. It's just a very challenging issue, but it has to be overcome. Okay. So I think I'd like to stop now for for this theme and have some issues here. Let me see. I think Dato' asked me a question about what is your concrete idea on how the Mindanao conflict will end. Well, it's a big question, but already, as I said, there is when you say the Mindanao conflict, I guess there are different kinds of conflict happening. It's still happening. I mean, I think in terms of the insurgency with the CPP-NPA, that is still ongoing.
Recording in progress.
And so it's very important that there's a move towards peace talks that can really end that particular armed conflict. I think in terms of other kinds of conflicts, the environmental conflicts to do with mining or other economic activities. You also have, I know, PVE in terms of violent extremism. I know Marawi happened 3 years ago, but I guess the issue there would be there's still thousands, I understand, still many people who were displaced by Marawi who still have not been able to return. So that I think would be very important in order to recover from that conflict. It's been at least, I think, 3 years since the siege ended. Okay. So it's not. I think there are a number of issues to do with ending conflicts, but each conflict will need to be analyzed closely in terms of its root causes. So if you think of conflicts related to human rights of women, certainly gender equality issues will remain, and therefore this requires an overcoming of patriarchy as a traditional cultural issue that needs to be transformed as well. So I hope my comments are not negative in that sense. I think there are steps forward in some areas, but in others there are challenges that need to be recognized and therefore worked with to be overcome. Okay. Case Tomnash Yusuf, case of Palestinians. There are now so many peace experts and peace advocates. Yes, it's been since 1948. Yes, I think we have to recognize that Israel has been able to have the support of one of the most powerful countries of the world, USA particularly. Then, of course, I think other countries are also are involved. So there's a great need. There's a great need for, in this case, in terms of GC peace education for American people, American citizens to really understand what is going on there, and that the conflict will continue as long as the Israel is ruled by politicians and elites who look at the Palestinians as simply disposable peoples, that not recognizing that when Israel was formed as a state, it actually was formed through the expulsion of Palestinians from their own homeland. And therefore, in terms of all the norms of international human rights, it's a contradiction. It's a contradiction. I think in terms of to be critical of Israel is not to be anti-Semitic. We recognize the Holocaust happened, that the Jewish people suffered greatly from the Holocaust, but at the same time, I think Palestinians are also human beings, and therefore they also have all those same rights as Israeli people. So it won't be easy, but I think it will need the, especially in this case, American people to fully understand what is going on, and then to, in a sense, wake up and transform U.S. foreign policy. And there are other Western countries also needs to do the same thing as well. But if you think also of the Middle East, Arabic countries, I think they also need to play a role. Some have established relations with Israel, understand for economic reasons, but that would also, I think, undermine the rights of Palestinians as well. Okay. Now, I think from from Hasim Tasil, in a world where we crave social connection, we continue to find ways to interact also environment. We also have greater empathy as, okay, well, I think, let me see, okay, we have greater empathy, so we're compelled to stay, change the way. For once, are we ready to embrace a new world order? If yes, yes, COVID-19 has affected all of us. The question, though, of course, is it just going to disappear soon? I think this is where the science of coronaviruses come in. I think it may not be that easy. I think countries that say, well, we have vaccinated over 50% or more of our population, but you have seen in the US there are still thousands of cases that have emerged. That's because the coronavirus is not a simple virus, and it keeps mutating, and new variants are formed all the time. And so I think all countries will have to really look closely at this virus and look closely at the strategies in order to really address it. Is it going to be just vaccines alone? And are we ready to embrace a new world order? If yes, then when? Well, I think if you're ready to embrace a new order, that means you are going to be committed to educating for and acting for a culture of peace. And when? I think for me, I don't think we need to predict when. I think it's better to say the more people are willing to embrace a new order, then we should rethink, organize, and act together within nations, but also across nations. And I think we are beginning to see more and more solidarity for action. Sometimes the mainstream media don't talk enough about that. Sometimes they talk about the problems, and they talk about the conflicts, but they don't, on the one hand, help people to understand the root causes of the conflict. And then they're not empowering in terms of showing examples, stories, hopeful stories of courage and people at the grassroots working a way to build peace in the communities. I think more should be done there by the mainstream media. I've been watching ABS, CBN's GMA news constantly now, but to say every program is almost 90% COVID. There really should be more news about what's happening in the country in terms of what people are doing, in terms of, even though in the middle of COVID, and how they rebuilding their lives, and also how they're challenging the dominant paradigms, rather than be left at just there is a COVID problem and we are very scared about it. Yes, it's important to people to be aware, but then at the same time, we should also have investigative journalism, analysis of the COVID problem itself. Okay, let me see now. Okay. Okay, the question, I'm not sure from whom, but it says, how can the national regional government understand and embrace loyalty and honesty in the roles they play in the implementation of government programs regarding frustration among young Muslims in what can be described as a push factor to social, historical, political marginalization that believed to be the cause of youth. So from the fire superintendent Ibrahim Gamalon. Well, when we think about values, values transformation, how can national, regional understand, embrace loyalty and honesty? There's something we citizens expect. We expect our leaders, local, national, regional, to be honest, to play their roles faithfully. So active citizenship then is not just its expectation. It's also when you do not see the consonance between professed values that people make in speeches or promises before elections or after elections, and therefore citizens will need to speak up. You say, well, you promise something, but it's not happening. If there is honesty, how come resources that should be distributed are not being distributed? For example, this is just an example. All over the world, citizens, when they're active, they can begin to put pressure on those people they have elected. Even if they're not elected particular politicians, leaders have that responsibility. And therefore, there's a great need for citizens to become awakened and empowered to together, joining hands and hearts and spirit to put pressure on those who have assumed leadership roles, roles of responsibility. There's no simple answer to that, but I think when citizens are passive, it allows those who are engaging in not engaging in fulfilling their responsibilities to say, well, I can do what I like, but nobody's talking about it. Nobody's putting pressure on me. So empowerment is so crucial in peace education and GCED. And as I say, it's not just you alone acting as an individual, but acting together with others in social action. I think there's a note about who can see your messages recording on. Not sure if it applies to me. Does it apply to me? I don't think so. Okay, from Nash Yusuf, how corruption can be combated in our nation. I think again, when it comes to corruption, there has to be capacity of various institutions. So the anti-corruption commissions, there's ombudspersons, but it also requires those who witness corruption to be able to speak out. It's not easy to be a whistleblower. Sometimes it's very dangerous to be a whistleblower. But when corruption has been addressed in many nations, it has to do with people becoming aware there is corruption. And secondly, the justice system. You have magistrates, you have justices, you have judges, you have political elites, leaders who are willing to challenge corruption. Okay. So the next question from Professor Abubakar, lots of money going to aid, particularly in BAM. Does aid equals peace? Does aid equal development? Well, then you have to see what the aid is used for. So you have to look closely at the policies that govern the aid. How is it expressed into programs and projects? And then what is it trying to address, the root causes? And what are the benefits of those projects and programs? Does it benefit everyone as it promises? Okay, so let me then move to the next theme so that we have time for the other themes and also later on a more general discussion. Okay, so thank you for all your comments at this stage. So human rights and responsibilities. I think it's clear all human rights for all peoples needs to be fulfilled. And now there are many international human rights instruments, and when countries sign onto those international conventions and agreements and covenants, they're expected to integrate it in their domestic laws and fulfill it in that way. Some countries, government leaders sign those international rights, but then they don't translate it into domestic law. That should happen. So it's a responsibility of all those who are in government to do so, and also for citizens to say where are the domestic implementation of the international laws. And when we talk about rights, it's not just civil rights, political rights, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. It's very holistic. All rights are interdependent. And of course, when there are violations, they should be abolished. And I know there are human rights commissions in the Philippines and in many other countries, and so they're trying to work at addressing violations of human rights by state agencies, but also by non-state actors as well, by citizens as well. We have seen across the world in recent times the rise of, if you like, populist leaders who also have a tendency to be very authoritarian, and so that also needs to be looked at, because when you have authoritarianism in politics in countries, it means then that rights can be violated, because it can't be just one leader saying X is right and therefore this is what should happen in the country. And democracy is a participatory process. So all citizens should have a role to play in determining the rights and wrongs of different policies. Okay. Also, we need to challenge in peace education and GC the cultural relativism, which is to say, in my culture, we do this, therefore nobody can question it. I think if we go that way, it means there are no longer any quote-unquote universal standards of human rights. If a country says torture is okay in my country, it's allowed, but then torture is a violation of a person's civil rights. You can charge a person for a crime or for any issue, and they can be imprisoned. But it doesn't mean that when you throw someone in prison, they don't have rights. So prisoners also have rights. Detainees have rights. So we need to implement the rule of law, and people need to understand what implementing rule of law means. The law itself in any situation and country can be unequal, can be unjust. So even the law itself needs to be transformed so that it doesn't promote injustices. It doesn't mean what is law, therefore is okay. There are some laws in many countries in different times have been unequal. For example, in Australia, it took a long time for Aboriginal people to vote, even though they've been there for 60,000 years in Australia. But it took a long time for Aboriginal people to get a vote. As you know, women, it took quite a while for women to get a vote in different countries. So the law itself is not infallible. Laws need to be looked at closely to say if they are actually fulfilling certain principles, and laws can be unjust, and laws can actually result in human rights violations. That is why different marginalized groups and sectors are saying what are our rights as workers, as farmers, as fisherfolk, as persons with disabilities, PWDs, indigenous peoples, the children, and now healthcare workers in the COVID situation. They have rights, and therefore, if they are promised benefits, etc., which should go to them, they have a right to receive those benefits, and they're working under very difficult conditions, very dangerous conditions. Gender discrimination, I think all over the world, the rights of women continue to be violated. And so then we have to look at the root cause of patriarchy. That means there's a need for cultural transformation. It doesn't mean that cultures remain fixed forever and ever. Cultures change all the time. And so if you think of the very specific issue of female genital mutilation, for example, in some cultures that practice it, they say, well, this is our culture, therefore you can't talk about it. But the women, especially who are subjected to female genital mutilation, say, you know, we are suffering all kinds of injuries. We can't even have children anymore. It's torture, and as a result, in countries where there is female genital mutilation, there's a lot of education of the groups and the cultural groups that still believe in it, and to convince the citizens of those groups to say that you can leave female genital mutilation behind, but your culture remains. It doesn't mean that if some specific practice in a culture is abandoned, then the whole culture disappears. No. Cultures are enhanced over time, and through learning from others, we enhance our cultures. Human rights is violated, and what that means is there are defenders, there are human rights workers, people work in human rights organizations, and unfortunately, all over the world, many human rights defenders are being persecuted, some are even disappeared, some are assassinated, and so there's a great need to defend those who defend human rights. And they cannot be left just to fulfill their role without protection and defense. And the UN is clearly pointing that out, that all human rights workers, defenders have to be defended because they're fulfilling a very crucial role in any society. Because once the human rights of citizens are violated, it means their lives are going to be affected from day one, from the time they're born. So everyone's human rights have to be defended, and you need human rights education. So in schools, I think I'm glad to see that in the Philippine basic curriculum, human rights education is a part of it. Yeah. And so institutions like universities also need to promote human rights. You can teach human rights education if within your own institution there are human rights violations. The rights of teachers, the rights of students, all have to be brought into the action on human rights education. Okay, I think there's still time for me to pause here for a discussion on the human rights theme. So let me see who has. Is there any comment on human rights? Okay, there's one here. Okay, let me see. Okay, there's one question. I think there are numbers. So this one here from Agnes Ortiga. What are your thoughts on the war of drugs of our President Duterte? Okay, I'd like to answer that question in a global context. Of course, drug addiction or substance abuse addiction is a very serious problem around the world. And there are all kinds of drugs. And right now in the US, for example, opioid is a very serious addiction. Before you have heroin and cocaine, of course, amphetamines or shabu is still there, but opioids is still the one prescribed by to treat certain conditions, are now resulting in a lot of overdoses in the US. So the term war on drugs was from a peace education perspective, I really prefer we don't talk of the war on this, on that, because war is implies a strategy which is in a sense can be militarized. I rather say, okay, drug addiction is a health problem. It's a health problem. Therefore, it should be looked at in terms of what are the root causes of this particular health problem. And there are many root causes for drug addictions. We know that from the evidence, from those who have been looking at drug addictions. And then how do we respond and overcome drug addictions? Now, if it is a health issue, then the responses need to be also in a health framework. But it doesn't mean, of course, that you don't worry about the issue of law enforcement, which is in terms of where are the drugs coming from. So are they being imported? And if they are being imported, that involves corruption, for example. Are your border agencies allowing drugs to come in without them being intersected? So that is one aspect of the whole drug issue around the world. Drug enforcement agents are trying their best to ensure that you don't have a flow of drugs from drug producing places, countries, and then imported, smuggled into other countries, so that accentuates the drug problem. And the US is faced in terms of the border with Mexico and other Central American, Latin American countries in terms of the flow of drugs for a long time now. But in terms of those who are affected personally by drug addictions, I think we also have to learn from policies of countries that have tried to approach it through a health perspective, in terms of how do we look at this as a health problem, and therefore those who are affected by drugs to be able to get them to overcome that addiction. And I think the approach that, for example, former Prime Minister Thaksin did in Thailand was to arrest, but also engage in harsh treatment, harsh approaches to the drug thing. But in the end, it did not work. Colombia did the same thing too. The president of Colombia also mentioned that we tried that, it doesn't work. Therefore, I think in terms of peace education, we need to look at the educational components, dimensions of looking at the drug problem. Because if you have a situation where many thousands of people are arrested and thrown into prison, does that really lead them to overcome their addictions? Will they go back to it after they come out of those detentions, for example? If you think in terms of what is referred to as EJKs, the issue though is whether that also results in overcoming the drug addiction problem. If, for example, you have many thousands of people involved in drug addiction, how does that help in terms of that they are no longer existing? Because what happens to their families? If they're breadwinners, what happens to their families? How do their families cope with the idea that the breadwinner is gone? So it also affects children, there's trauma. So my thoughts are we need to learn from the global perspective on looking at drug addictions and overcoming it in educational and in a health and social way. So that's my response to that issue. Okay, let me see now. There are many comments. So let me see. Okay, one is on vaccines from Nash Yusuf. The various kinds of vaccines, are they safe? Discover vaccines familiar, you're supposed to be cured for the people of the world. I think this is where we need educationally we look at vaccines in the very deep way. Vaccines, according to the data, the millions of doses have been given, and the argument of the medical specialists and governments too will be that vaccines in terms of COVID will prevent serious infections leading to even death. So, and those who are not vaccinated are likely to if they're infected, then they have a higher chance to get serious illness and therefore even die. So that is the argument. But of course, we are seeing now at the same time there are variants appearing where these earlier vaccines, the one I produced, there's this thing called escape. Therefore, it's possible that the new variants of coronavirus can be escaping from the vaccines that have been produced based on the earlier variants. So we need to look at that carefully, and therefore that is why now there is talk about a booster shot. But you can see the problem there. If those who have been vaccinated twice, and in some vaccines it appears that in Indonesia, for example, those who have been vaccinated twice with a particular vaccine have become infected again, and some have even died, including healthcare workers. So then we have to look at different vaccines in terms of the efficacy. But safety is also long-term and short-term. So at the moment, the vaccines that have been produced and distributed, I think cannot claim long-term safety because long-term needs time to establish long-term efficacy. But that doesn't mean that therefore they don't play a role. Myself, personally, I think there's also a need to look at alternative or complementary treatments or even preventative measures. For example, there's now more and more science has established that some traditional herbal medicines, therapies can be very helpful in treating COVID and also even preventing COVID from becoming more serious. But at the moment, the argument of governments around the world and the WHO is vaccines. But I think it would be good to also look at the possibility for citizens in different countries also to be provided with alternative therapies which can be helpful, and this is where more and more studies are showing that those alternative treatments can be helpful. And by doing that, then it would meet the gap in terms of amount of available vaccines, but it's also at the same time the issue of side effects. So whether or not some of those vaccines have side effects, yes, I think they have some side effects, but to what extent those side effects will say therefore no vaccines. I know some people have said because of side effects therefore I will not take it, but of course the risk there is if you have no vaccines at all, then you in a way are more exposed. But those who don't take vaccines, if they are also taking some alternative preventative treatment, then I think they may be more safe as well. So I think there needs to be more discussion of vaccine as the only tool in terms of meeting the problem of coronavirus, of COVID-19. Okay. I think, let me see. Okay, Boots is saying Afghanistan is already occupied by Taliban. I think the current situation is very grave for Afghanistan. I think it's the speed at which the Taliban now have been able to take over so many regional capitals up to the third largest city. I think there are some commenters that say it's not a matter of Kabul falling, it's a matter of when. And some say it might be fairly soon. And that's why the Americans and the British and other countries are now moving, pulling their, repatriating their own citizens out of Afghanistan. I think, and also those who've been working for them as interpreters to take them out of danger. And so while peace talks are ongoing in Doha between the Taliban and the government, commenters saying these peace talks are not really working. They're stalemate. And in the meantime, it looks like the strategy of the Taliban is to regain power of Afghanistan. I guess if they do that, I think the hope is that it won't be exactly the same Taliban as happened decades ago. But it's a Taliban which can learn some lessons in terms of how it treats women, for example. I heard one Taliban commander leader saying, we made some mistakes, and therefore girls should be allowed to be schooled. So if that happens, then that will be different than in the beginning when the Taliban said girls should not go to school. Okay, I think somebody was asking for copy of the PowerPoint. Okay, I think it needs some editing, so I will coordinate with the team at CSU in terms of revised PowerPoint. So, question from Nasruddin Ibra: how will the political problem end here in the Philippines because civilians are suffering some political rivalry? Well, I have no way to predict how it will end in the Philippines. But again, as I say, if citizens become active, then they should one be able to try to understand the dynamics of the political complications. Now I know elections is coming up, and also there should be voter education so that when people vote, they will not be swayed by personalities. They should really look at promises of would-be candidates and be able to get answers from would-be candidates as to how those policies and promises would actually benefit the people. And I think investigative journalists should also play a role there. If you're a journalist and you simply ask a candidate to say, what is your policy, full stop, and you end there, that is not investigative journalist. I think you should be able to ask more questions to challenge a would-be candidate to fully explain their policy and to be able to justify why their policy will work and will actually benefit the people. I certainly hope that that there will be this kind of voter education, and that more and more citizens will be able to look at elections in the long term. I know it's difficult for many people now, especially with COVID-19, but even without COVID-19, for example, if you offer X pesos to vote for a candidate, I think you should really say, if I do that, will his or her policies actually bring me my basic needs? I may get a few hundred pesos now, but in the long term, will I have enough employment, jobs? Will I have environmental sustainability, and so on and so forth? So voters need to think in the long term in terms of who they vote for, and also be able to compare. So that past administrations have done this, that, and so what are their policies? Okay. I think now I will move to the next segment. And I think I should move a bit quicker now because there are 3 more segments. So the next theme is building intercultural respect, reconciliation, and solidarity. And of course, we always say in peace education and GCED, there are so many cultures across the world, but also within any country. The Philippines has so many cultures. So many regional cultures, but also you have indigenous peoples, Lumans, Cordillerans, you have Moros, you have different religious groups, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, indigenous spirituality. So how do we foster intercultural understand respect? Because when you don't have understanding and respect, it can lead to conflicts, right? It can lead to discrimination. But when we teach about culture, let us not reduce culture to the 4 Ds. Cultures have different dances, different food or diets, different dialects and languages, different dresses. It's all very well to teach children about those differences, but that's not good enough, because culture is more than just the food you eat, the dress you wear, the language you speak, the dance you dance. It's about you as a whole being, which is your culture has values and principles and wisdom and the whole history. So when we educate for culture in our schools, let us look at it in a deep way so that we really learn from each other. And at the same time, we are willing to say there is wisdom in all cultures. Therefore, what can we learn from them? How can we enrich our cultures through learning from the wisdom of other cultures, without, of course, diminishing our own culture or destroying our cultures? Something that enriches our culture does not destroy our culture. And of course, we need to overcome racism and discrimination. Racism and discrimination, as the Black Lives Matter advocates point out, is not just personal. It's not just I'm a racist towards someone. I don't like black people. It's also about institutional or systemic racism. That means when Black Americans turn up at a workplace, they are appointed not because their color does not matter, it's their capacities, or they're promoted on the basis of their knowledge and abilities. If they go to get housing, they should get housing the same way as other people. So just personal racism being overcome is not sufficient. You need to overcome systemic and institutional racism. Okay, so these are just some covers of books here of having multicultural education. We are different, but we're all equal and all together. You say no to racism. That means in your school curriculum, when students come across indigenous peoples in the textbook, they should not be looked at as strange people, or their customs are quote unquote backward. They have no wisdom. In the past, indigenous peoples were called savages. They were referred to in a very discriminatory way. They have no spirituality. Now that's changing slowly across the world. In countries like Canada, the First Nations peoples still have a long way to go, but they are rising up and saying, we are First Nations. We were here before the Europeans. And yet we are still faced with racism. And when our children were basically kidnapped and sent to residential schools, taken away from our families by force, many never survived those residential schools. And recently, many bodies of First Nations children have been discovered buried near those schools, and some of them were run by church missions as well. And so all over the world, indigenous peoples are saying we have our culture, we have our lands, we have ancestral domains, and we need to be recognized. We need to survive culturally, economically, and socially. And I know in the Philippines you have many millions of indigenous peoples with many different languages and traditions. And yet, of course, they are being faced with challenges such as mining and dams, which have resulted in some cases displacement, environmental destruction as well. And yet, I think the Philippines is a signatory to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Okay. So that's why the dominant paradigm of development has had a great impact on indigenous peoples, and that needs to be addressed. The Iran is saying, Assad's claim we're bringing progress, but what they bring are empty promises. So indigenous peoples in the Amazon, other countries are still struggling for their rights to ancestral lands and challenging corporate globalization. Okay. I know IPs in Mindanao protesting against mining, also in nearest in other parts of the country as well. Tribal women in India protesting against dam construction because once the dams are built, they're flooded and they lose their homes, their lands, and their livelihoods as well. In Brazil, the indigenous peoples have really organized themselves against constitutional amendments under the current government, which is really going to undermine their rights even further. The Bolsonaro government is really opening the Amazon to more extraction, to more lynching, and more deforestation. Okay. One success story here is the Dongarga people in India who struggled against the Vedanta mining of bauxite, and they were able to stop it. Finally, the Supreme Court of India says no to Vedanta. No, you cannot mine on ancestral homelands and mountains of the Dongarga people. But there were also a lot of support from all over the world for their campaign. Now to move to the role of religion and faith. Religion and faith plays a major role across the world. Although, of course, there's secularism, and there are some number of human beings who do not believe in religion, and that's the right, not to believe in a God or any religion. That's a right. It's human right to believe or not to believe. But the important thing is that religions and faiths now are recognizing that religion and faith should help to promote a culture of peace rather than a culture of violence. Now, it doesn't make sense to say that religion can promote violence, but when we look at it carefully in terms of practices, in terms of even some readings in the sacred text, it's actually linked to unpeaceful conduct and beliefs. And therefore, there are leaders and believers of different faiths who are saying, no, within our faiths and religions, we actually have principles and values for peace, for justice. And of course, nowadays we say we also have principles for sustainability, for green theology. In Islam, the Prophet, peace be unto him, had pointed out this urgency that all Muslims should care about the trees and the natural environment as part of being a Muslim. So religions and faiths now are saying we need to understand each other. That's why interfaith dialogue is growing, and Mindanao, I think, is a very good example of that. I've been, from the time I started my activities in peace education here, I've been very inspired by the work of Christian faith, indigenous leaders, communities in terms of interfaith dialogue. So Sila dialogue movement started by Father Sebastiano Diambra. He's a graduate of peace education in NDU. He's been doing it for over 40 years now. And the Bishop Lama Forum has been, and I think the role these interfaith dialogue movements have played in promoting the peace process, also in terms of working with each other to promote a more just world, a more sustainable world, to end militarization. I think that is a really crucial role that religions and faiths can play. And of course, when we talk about violent extremism that can be fostered, if you like, catalyzed by religious motivation. Now, of course, you can say religions don't promote violent extremism, but those groups and leaders involved in violent extremism do make use of this or that aspect of religious teachings in a distorted way to promote violent extremism. So it's so important that the leaders and believers within a particular faith community will challenge those sorts of attempts to motivate violent extremism through religion and faith, through distortions. And I think that's one of the factors that's been pointed out in studies done on PVE in Mindanao and other parts of the world. And also there's a need to clarify and even reread doctrines and interpretations, because religions are promoted over centuries, and some of the institutional practices may reflect more the culture rather than the religion. So if the core religion says women and men are equal, there should be no gender discrimination, and yet if you look at the practices of particular religions and there is discrimination, then that gap needs to be overcome. And that's why there are religious faith leaders who are pointing out that we need to question interpretations and doctrines that actually promote practices that are inconsistent with the core values and principles of our faith and religion. And that's a very crucial role that faith and religions can play. Okay, so let me see in terms of time. If I'm right, I still have about half an hour left. Yes. So perhaps I can stop here. No, perhaps I won't stop here because I think I'm afraid the time might run out. So let me go on with the next theme first, and then we'll have time for the discussion. So first of all, when we talk about the theme of living sustainably in harmony with the earth, we know there's this deepening environmental crisis, destruction of the world, all kinds of symptoms. And we also know there is such a thing called ecological footprint. In our education for sustainable development, we need to point out that the ecological footprint of people in the global north are so many times heavier than people in the global south. That means basically people in the global north are living as though we have many planets. So that if all countries in the world try to live like people in the global south, we need more than one planet. But we have only one planet. Therefore, it's so important that people in the global north or those living in the global south who are living at a level where their footprint is much, much heavier to rethink how they're living so that their footprint is no longer so heavy. And therefore, climate change is now with us. The intensity of storms, the Philippines, you're feeling it now. All countries, even recently in China, there's severe flooding. There's a rise in global warming, and therefore sea levels are rising. The Philippines is 7,000 islands. If this continues, how many islands will be left in the Philippines? So many cities that are low-lying will be flooded. And where will the people go when we have that kind of flooding of cities, when the sea levels are rising? Island countries are not to the South Pacific. They're really speaking up not to say that unless climate change is addressed, we will not exist. We will not exist. And so heavy precipitation, but at the same time you can have heavy drought, tremendous drought in different times in different parts of the world. The glaciers are shrinking, the permafrost are thawing. And we are seeing now that as heat increases, as temperature increases, the implications for health, because pests and pathogens actually also increase their capacities as the temperature rises. Agriculture, forestry, energy, even tourism will be affected because loss of biodiversity. Just a few days ago, the UN Governmental Panel on Climate Change came out with this new report, and you should read it. It's very sobering. It's really pointing out that climate change is widespread, rapid, intensifying all over the world, every region, and those changes are irreversible if we don't really stop now. Okay, and so the increase in temperatures, if it continues, we will have terrible consequences for many parts of the world, for humanity. And this then brings us to solutions. So how do we deal with the crisis of climate change? If you remember the Paris climate talks a number of years ago, the leaders there were very happy they signed an agreement, the Paris Climate Change Agreement. But those who are active in addressing climate change, including the scientists, are saying, wait a minute, the Paris climate change is even weaker than the previous Kyoto protocols. Why? Because it's very voluntary. It says countries should reduce their carbon emissions, but it's left to countries to do it voluntarily. And the result is you've seen many countries have not voluntarily reduced their carbon emissions. In fact, it's even recent in many cases. Therefore, we have to go back to development. The dominant paradigm does address environmental destruction. When the elites of the world gather together, they say we have to be concerned about climate change. It can affect our business, affect the economy. So how do we deal with it? They say, well, we need clean energy, we need recycling, we need renewable energies, we need technological innovations. We can have green growth, okay? Green growth. But the question I ask is, how big is the growth and how big is the green? So you can have growth that promises to be green, but in reality, it's not that green because it also still results in increasing carbon emissions and use of fossil fuels. Then even when it's supposed to be recycling, let me give this very basic example. Ukai, the second-hand clothing that's coming from advanced countries, north to global south countries, to be resold in the ukai. The evidence now is when charities receive recyclable clothes, they don't use all of them. They actually, they can't use all of them because some of them are already rejects. They can't be sold as second-hand clothing. So they pack them in, tons of them are sent to countries that receive them, like countries in Africa, I think the Philippines probably received some recycled clothing as well. And then when they open up those bags, they find that 40% in Ghana of those recycled had to be thrown away because they cannot be resold too. So what happens is that this terrible garbage collection of unusable used clothing that has come from the industrialized countries. So recycling per se doesn't always lead to the consequence it promises to be. Biofuels supposed to be more renewable energy, but countries like Brazil now are converting land to sugarcane that produces the biofuel. And that means you are destroying the Amazon and other parts of Brazil to produce more biofuels. So solutions can appear to be environmentally sustainable, but in the long run, they actually have consequences which are not that sustainable. And therefore, that leads us to asking, what are the root causes of ecological crisis? And this is where the peace paradigm, the alternative paradigm says it's about consumption. The overconsumption of a minority of the world's population across nations and within nations is what is driving climate change. If everyone were to live more simply, then there's less carbon. If everyone were to live in a way that more justly, then everyone has enough basic needs to live on. But the dominant paradigm encourages over-consumerism and obsolescence. So after a short while, this model is no longer usable. It still is usable, but then you need iPhone 12 or 13 now. The point is, the early iPhones are still usable. So there are many products that are made in order to become obsolescent very quickly in order that the customer will spend more to buy the new models. The same with vehicles, many products that are now overconsumed. So unless we rethink how we develop the world, and this is where I think I want to be clear on this, the current capitalist paradigm development globalization is very problematic for addressing climate change because it's about profit maximization, it's about overuse of resources, mine, if we need resources for this and that, we just get it from other countries. If we have produced waste, we will ship them across countries to the Philippines, so you will get our waste, and you bury them somewhere, and some of those waste are toxic. I'm glad to see that the Philippines sent back the Canadian waste back to Canada a couple of years ago. I think it's very important, also back to South Korea. But the point is, why were they accepted in the first place? Why were they accepted in the first place by whoever accepted those waste? So there are countries in Africa that have become toxic dumps. Some of the waste are highly dangerous, hospital waste, even radioactive waste. So unless we rethink the way we live in the world, then climate change is going to be with us and leading us towards more and more destruction of the world and therefore humanity. So what we need is a sense of justice, which is eco-justice or green justice. Justice is not just economic, social, political, cultural, it's also environmental justice or eco-justice. And this is where we come back again to faith and spirituality traditions. There are many really green values within all faiths and spiritual traditions, which we should draw on and guide the way we live and also guide systemic policies within a country or nation. So let me, since I've talked for a bit now on those last two themes, let's see what the questions are, comments are. Okay. How do we associate culture to these environmental issues? Okay. Okay, culture, environmental issues. Well, culture broadly is, if you think of definite culture, is all the values, principles, and the way we live in the world, the way we use resources, the way we treat each other. Culture is not just about human relationships. Culture is about relationships between people and the environment, people and nature. And therefore, as I say, over time, all cultures have within them principles and values and practices that actually sustain the environment. Indigenous peoples are a good example. Over many thousands of years, indigenous peoples have learned to live in relative harmony with their nature. Of course, that has changed with the advent of the dominant parent and globalization, so that even it's possible for some indigenous communities and even leaders to say, come in and mine the land, and we will get some benefits from it. Come in and grow some cash crops and we benefit from it. But if you think of the consequences of some of those projects, it's actually contrary to the indigenous values of living in harmony with the earth. And so I know there are polarization within indigenous communities in terms of those development projects. But I think I'm always inspired by indigenous leaders and peoples who say our traditions is about living sustainably. And if peoples living in the cities and other parts of the country can learn from us, it will, in the long run, also benefit future generations of your grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren. So the indigenous peoples always say, think of the 7 generations, not just the next generation. Okay. So that is my comment in terms of culture and nature. And let me see. Okay. Okay, since 1989, from Dr. Pantalopius, we have talked about environmental crisis, but they did not terrify me as the realities that do now. Okay. Yes, it's true that climate change has really, raised the fear levels because the impact is really great. But that's why I remember in 1989, the Catholic bishops had this, I think, very beautiful pastoral letter. It says, "What is happening to a beautiful land?" And already the bishops said, we're predicting the potential outcomes of policies that destroy the land. And now we are reaping the consequences of it. I guess our hope is that more and more people, and this is where the youth are coming in, there are many young people around the world who are speaking even more loudly than their parents about climate change. And I think that that's inspirational, and we should encourage not just our youth and children, but also adults to think about what is going to happen to their great-great-grandchildren. And when we come to inner peace, I think we will ask the question, if we consume it in a particular way, are we more peaceful in an inner sense? Do we increase our inner sense because we have more to spend, more money to spend, more consumer goods to buy, and so on? So that's a question I leave to the next segment. Okay. Okay, someone says watch the movies Waterworld. Okay, all right. Well, there are some. Certainly, Hollywood has been catching on in terms of the consequences of environmental destruction. My concern would be some of those films don't help enough in terms of understanding the root causes of that environmental destruction. Waste products done with, yes, I think the radioactive waste. I think that's part of the problem of nuclear waste. And that's why when we hear countries saying nuclear power is the way to go, because nuclear power doesn't emit carbon emission, and therefore it is a better energy than fossil fuels and coal. I think we need to stop there because, first of all, when it comes to mining uranium, that also involves carbon emission. That's one thing. Secondly, the nuclear waste. I think as Dr. Tan pointed out, nuclear waste have to be dealt with. When you have nuclear power, you have nuclear waste. I was in Fukushima in 2012. That's a year after the Fukushima nuclear explosion happened. We were with a group of Buddhist and faith leaders, interfaith delegation that went to visit Fukushima. And you could see the destruction there, and also pointing out that the radioactivity has not disappeared. And as we know recently, countries have been protesting against the dumping of the radioactive wastewater. Thousands of tons of them are going to be dumped into the ocean. And the Japanese will say, well, they will, the radioactive waste will dissolve in the water and so on and so forth, and therefore it is not going to be dangerous to the rest of the world. But the point is, when you put in radioactive waste into the ocean, it does contaminate the ocean. And the thousands of barrels of wastewater remains. Of course, we have seen that that Japan is very keen to say that it's back to normal, but many of the nuclear plants around the world are getting older, and when they get older, there are more potential to accidents. Therefore, I'm not sure that reviving the nuclear power plant in the Philippines is environmentally and also socially the best way to deal with the energy problem in a country like the Philippines. Okay, then let me since we're getting to the last 15 minutes, I'd like to then move to the sixth theme, and this is cultivating inner peace. Already, I have, as we go through the themes, you will see that I have been mentioning aspects of the other themes because they are related, they're interrelated. So when we talk about cultivating inner peace, we are acknowledging that the world today, there are anxieties, there is alienation, there is rise of suicides in many countries. There's a sense of helplessness, alienation, loss of meaning. And I know COVID has aggravated the problem because of all the lockdowns and all the separation of children from their school, from the social interactions of everyone. And so the mental health aspect of COVID is also increasingly recognized and has to be dealt with. So inner peace is very important as much as social peace. And this is where I think we need to link to consumerism. If you have more to consume, does that mean, quote unquote, you become happier? And the Taoist teachings have this phrase that say, how much is enough? When you know what is enough, it will always be enough. So at the moment, the way globalization works is we don't have enough. Therefore, we need more and more. We need to earn more and more. We need to consume more and more. We need to produce more and more. But this is at a great cost, I think, not just to the environment, but also I think to the inner peace, because people are always thinking how to get more and more, and if they can't get more and more, they can't live like their neighbor. They're unhappy. They may have sometimes more than one job. Now, this is not to say that everyone is like that. The marginalized poor of the world, for them, is getting food on the table. So it's not about getting more consumer goods. It's just basic needs. But it doesn't mean that even poorer citizens cannot become convinced by advertisements and other media means by which they actually think I should get more of this and that. So sometimes they may waste precious resources on food or drinks which may not be healthy, but also in terms of displacing nutritious and basic food. For example, some of the fast foods, etc. So we need time for spiritual growth. We need time for meditation and reflection. We need to move to rethink a way of living, and therefore we need to think about voluntary simplicity as opposed to having quantity of life. Quality of life is really crucial in building inner peace. I think I've talked about addictions as a health problem. And last but not least, when we talk about inner peace, it should not be, if you like, self-centered inner peace. It's about inner peace that also links with the outer peace. There is a meditation industry, that kind of well-being industry in North America where people pay thousands of dollars to go to a workshop or retreat, and at the end of X days, they come out feeling more peaceful, happier, but then they go back to environments which are rather peaceful and unpeaceful and stressful. So, and they don't worry about the rest of the world. So if we cultivate an inner peace, we should also be very concerned about the peace of others. Therefore, inner peace should be linked to outer peace. So in some schools in the world, like in Bhutan and even in North America, Western Europe, teachers facilitate meditation and contemplation so that young children learn from an early age to slow down, to look into within themselves. Nowadays, as you know, with social media and IT, children are spending even more time texting away on Messenger or Twitter or TikTok and so on and so forth. And so we have to ask whether that move to IT is necessarily beneficial in terms of the healthy, spiritual, and social development of our youth. I'm not anti-technology, but I think always technology is a tool that needs to be looked at carefully in terms of its promotion of peace as opposed to peacelessness. And okay, so before I go to the last slide, I'd like now to, and getting near the end of the workshop now, or the webinar, I'd like to see if there are any other comments from others. I don't see any more new ones. Perhaps those who would like to say something, are you all able to unmute yourself and say something? Because it'd be good to hear you as well, not just from the chat. Any comments on inner peace as a theme? Perhaps I can ask you a question then. In the summary output presented by Lieutenant Colonel Banyada, inner peace was not mentioned in your discussions. Is that because inner peace to you is not important? Who would like to respond to that question? I'm not seeing any chat. I'm not really sure. Are you hearing me? Are you hearing me?
Sir, pardon, can
Yes.
be asked the question again, sir?
Oh, okay. In your summary of your output of the discussion, of the students' discussion, I did not see the term inner peace in your reflections, but I'm not sure it's because you didn't explicitly mention it, or whether inner peace is not so important to your group, to your community.
So we agree that I think we just neglected not to include inner peace. May I inform you, sir, that the group activity, for that preparation, I think we reach almost midnight in our preparation. So I think that is just a neglect on our part. But we submit that it is very material. So we are very sorry, sir, that we really neglected to include it in our preparation.
Well, thank you. No, it's not to apologize. I appreciate. I know it was done at very short notice, and working at midnight shows your commitment. So thank you. I remember inner peace when we began in 1986. We put it forward as a theme, and I remember it was a personal peace. Inner peace was something that in the workshops was responded to positively by many participants. I remember when we did a workshop with the soldiers in 603 Brigade in the soldiers, for them, personal inner peace was very important. And we did start with personal inner peace as a theme before we moved to the more challenging themes like human rights and so on. So I think the Philippines inner peace is certainly considered a theme to be developed. But as I say, inner peace needs to be interconnected with inner peace. Thank you. Any other final comments on just all other themes? Yes.
What is disturbing to many Filipinos today is the many posts of researches on the effects of the vaccines. Some of these posts would say that those who had been vaccinated will die in 2 years, and that because of the vaccines, the countries that made them would now have many information regarding the constitutional framework or makeup, especially of the women. And then personally, there is one thing that is bothering me. I have been thinking that governments have been killing their people deliberately because we are way beyond the feeding and the carrying capacity of the earth. What do you say?
COVID-19 has actually raised the, sort of given many good examples of fake news. In terms of what is happening in media, especially social media, COVID-19 has become a source of one of those major sources of fake news. Now, so what does fake news mean? It means it is news based on misinformation, but it's also it's saying something that when you read it superficially appears to be like, well, maybe it's true. But the point is you always need to go back to the science. And I think we can agree that in terms, as I said before, long-term safety of vaccines cannot be, if you like, established now. Long-term means long-term. So it would take many years to establish the long-term safety of any medical product. The current vaccines are emergency use authorization. So I know Pfizer is trying to have it approved in the CDC US as a approved vaccine. But at the moment, all the vaccines are for authorized use, emergency use, because of the emergency situation of COVID. So I would suggest, in order to be able to, when you receive a piece of information, news about COVID-19 vaccines, to do the homework. So, for example, I go to a website called Thailand Medical News. Why? Because that Thailand Medical News actually gives summaries and reports of many researchers all over the world, not just Thai, but also American, West European medical researchers have been looking into research on vaccines and their effects and so on and so forth. So that way you get a better idea of the science behind the vaccines. And then you still have to make a decision. And this is because science is not monolithic. There are differences in scientific opinions about the vaccines. So there are some vaccines who will point out some of the quote-unquote possible dangers of the vaccines. There are others who say the risk of a number of people getting adverse reactions compared to those who will not get serious infections. The risks overcome the fear of those possible adverse reactions. And then people have to make a decision themselves as to your decision in terms of vaccines. But I would suggest not to be, because you come along, there was on fake news, for example, that says COVID-19 is not a virus, it's a bacteria, for example. So which is really contrary to what is known. It is one of the coronaviruses. So media literacy is very important in GCED, so that our whoever is listening to news and receiving news, especially on social media about vaccines, will be able to make a fairly informed decision for themselves and not be simply believing that what has come through is truth. But this is not to say that they may need. We're not saying. I don't think any of the vaccine manufacturers, governments can actually promise that there are no long-term safety effects. Because long-term means several years before you can say long-term. But short-term, they will say, if you look at the millions of doses that have been given, yes, a small percentage of people has had adverse reactions. A few have even died. Or those who have been double-dosed, vaccinated, like in Indonesia, there are several doctors who have been double-dosed and contracted COVID and died. But it doesn't mean, though, that everyone who has been vaccinated double dose, as soon as they get infected, they will die. No, I think the evidence is they may have some reactions or some infections or mild infections, so on, but it doesn't mean they die. But at the moment, the evidence is those who have not been vaccinated in the US have been the ones who have been affected most seriously with the Delta strain, right? But on the other hand, there are some research coming out. Israel, which is one of the highest vaccinated country in the world, where they have noticed that those who have been double dose vaccinated have actually been infected even a bit more than those who have been not vaccinated. But they're not sure why. They're not sure. Science is not telling us why yet. So it's complex in that sense. It's complex in that sense. But I myself feel that we should also be looking at alternative therapies also, because I think the vaccine solution is very much cast in terms of Western medicine. But in terms of Eastern medicines, indigenous medicines, there's also been over thousands of years, all sorts of herbals have been used in order to overcome some of the symptoms of infections and so on. And they have been working. And so those who believe in those indigenous herbals can take them together with vaccines, or for some people, maybe even an option to vaccine. So I would be very careful about fake news when it comes to vaccines about the coronavirus. So I hope that clarifies your question a bit.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Good morning. Good noon, Dr. To.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. First and foremost, my privilege to meet you, even though although only in virtual. In relation to what Ma'am Boots asked you a while ago, in these times of intense stress, it is most difficult to find our peace and balance. Everybody struggle with our need for control and predictability in times when the rules of the government in relation to the COVID-19 are changing daily. So we must find our own personal balance of how much news we need to stay informed without inundating ourselves with fear and anxiety. So my question is, how do we balance this mandate of the government with regards to the COVID-19 protocol with our need for human connection? And also, how do we process the loss of lives and panic we're experiencing around us with our own need to find peace within us? So those are the questions. Maybe it's true to everyone nowadays because of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, the lockdowns and restrictions are often imposed by authorities, including governments, local governments, or national governments, and so citizens have to follow them. I mean, for example, in Australia, if you don't follow the protocols, now you get fined $1,000 immediately. And the current government has even called on the Australian military to help the police to sort of enforce those, not so much arrest people, but to help the police as they go about trying to enforce those restrictions. So, so how you establish personal peace, inner peace? Now, because there is this online mechanism available to some people, if not all, that has been helpful. Can you imagine if in this period there is no Zoom or no way to connect with your relatives online? I think that'd be even worse, right? So I think that's at least is helpful in terms of a virtual connection, even if it's not face to face. Some education can continue. Personally, I think face-to-face peace workshops are much more interactive, because interactive and important. But in my experience with online peace education, it's possible to include some activities and also be social, engage in dialogue as well. So it's but the personal peace, of course, begins with everyone. And as I said before, even without COVID, it's possible to be become attached to things, attached to power, attached to greed, and when you do that, you really mess up your inner peace, I think, because you're always struggling, you're always striving to get more, to be more powerful, to appear richer, to be more fashion status. If you don't have a particular model or a particular thing, then somehow you are deficient. And that really affects your personal peace. So if we work at our personal peace, and you can, even with COVID, you can meditate, contemplate, and you can even do it in Zoom fashion nowadays. And so once you start doing that, then I think you're able to find a balance that can relate to the COVID lockdowns restrictions. As we know, in my own case, for example, I wasn't able to go back to Australia to visit my mother, who was quite getting old age, and when she passed on, I wasn't there. I was able to see her on Facebook Messenger once, a couple of weeks before she passed on. So it's sad, but we recognize that it's because COVID is there. So we do not become angry at COVID because that happened. It's just part of life that it happened that way. So we can still, I prayed for her here in Canada. I sent all my heartfelt condolences and so on. I remember the times I had with my parents. So we do in that way, we're able to attain the balance without being over disturbed by something called COVID. But it's so important that active citizens also begin to ask questions of policies of the leaders and governments. Why? What is the basis for your? What is the rationale for your policy? What is a long-term policy? What is what are you doing in a way that can meet the needs of people? I know at the moment you have Ayuda, yes, but the question is Ayuda really enough? The question would be, how is Ayuda distributed, for example, and so on and so forth. So I think it's possible. It's a challenge, but it must be done. Otherwise, you become more and more unpeaceful as you are affected by something called COVID-19. I mean, we're hoping it will come a time when we can say it's over. But perhaps it may not be over in that sense. Perhaps it'll be with us. Perhaps just like if you think of the flu has been with us for a long time and it's still with us. So how do we relate to the flu? We also have to think, how do we relate to COVID-19? So I hope that responds a bit to your very important question. I think there is okay, I'll just mention from Hasim Tasil. If you want to find real peace and joy, you need God. Find God, receive eternal life in heaven, receive true joy and peace. Yes, for some, for a number of people in the world, many people in the world, religion of faith is a way by which they can attain more inner peace, and that's very important. But as we say, I have friends who are not not religious, are not in the sense they do not believe in a religion or faith, organized faith, but still they have their spirituality, and for them they cultivate their spirituality, and with that the inner peace as well. So I think, if I'm not wrong, I'm over time. Is that right? It's the end of the webinar in terms of my 3 hours. Am I correct in terms of timing?
Yeah.
So I know there can be more time to dialogue and more responses to your very important questions.
Hello, local citizens. Can you hear me? Okay. So in behalf of the university officials, I'd like to thank our renowned, well-known speaker, Dr. Swee-Hin, for his comprehensive sharing, as well as the discussions, as well as sharing his time and expertise in the different issues of peace and development, especially to the local as well as to the international arena. Then I'd like also to thank our president, the first university president, Dr. Semajid Dilna, for his support of this activity. And of course, to the untiring support of our dean, Dr. Giamaluntar Hata. Thank you po, madam. Then to the professors, especially Dr. Nuruddin Salam, for organizing this activity together with your students. The Philippine National Police taking up Doctor of Philosophy in Peace and Development, as well as the Masters of Peace and Development. And of course, to all the students from the public ad, from the education, as well as from other program of our university. Then also to all professors who are in attendance, I'd like to mention our former dean from the graduate school, Dr. Estrella Cantaliopes. Thank you po, madam. And to my professor, Honorable Dr. Susan Anayatin. Thank you, madam. To Commissioner Dato Manong Abubakar, thank you. To Dr. Dato Tobla, as well as to Dr. Abdul Jain, thank you for giving your time with this seminar. Then lastly, I'd like to end this activity by saying this. I have to leave three challenges with all of us. I think you remember the OPM song, which goes like this. Kung ano ang di mo gusto, wag gawin sa iba. Kung ano ang iyong inutang, ay siya ring kabayaran. And I think that's the golden rule. Do not do unto others if you don't want that others will do it unto you. Then second challenge to all of us. According to St. John Paul II, if you want to reach peace, you have to teach peace. Then lastly, as Mother Teresa said, St. Teresa of Calcutta, she said, peace begins with a smile. So therefore, there's also a song which goes like this. Smile, though your heart is aching. Smile, though your heart is breaking. So with that, once again, Dr. Swee-Hin, I think we met thrice already. The last one is in Davao. You remember the magic in Davao? So, hope to see you again in person. And hopefully we can invite you in person pag mawala na ang COVID. So once again, people of the Philippines, people of the Bangsamoro people, we have to spread peace from within, then hopefully it will radiate to the community and of course to the global. So once again, thank you very much. Mabuhay tayong lahat. God bless us all.
School, Cotabato State University. Thank you very much, sir.
We'll end our webinar. Let us have first our closing prayer. May I request Ustad Saudi B. Abubakar, MAIS, Cotabato State University, member of the Board of Regents.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Swee. Okay, let us pray. وقال ربكم ادعوني استجب لكم امين يا رب العالمين وخير الناصرين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. آمين يا رب العالمين وخير الناصرين. ربي أدخلني مدخل صدق وأخرجني مخرج صدق وأجعل لي من لدنك سلطانا نصيرا. Ya Allah, cause us to enter a sound entrance and to exceed a sound exit, and grant us from yourself a supporting authority. Amin ya Rabbal Alamin wa khairan nasirin. Allahumma inna nas'aluka sihhata fil iman wa imanan fi husnil khuluq wa najahan yatba'uhu fulahun wa rahmatan minka wa afiyatan wa maghfiratan minka wa ridwana. Ya Allah, we beg you to grant us health with faith, faith with good conduct, success followed by further success, mercy and healing, and your forgiveness and your satisfaction. Allahumma rabbana atina fid dunya hasana wa fil akhirati hasanatan wa qina azabannar birahmatika arhamar rahimin walhamdulillah.
Amen. Thank you very much, sir. This program would not come to an end without the photo opportunity for posterity. So we will begin